Lack of empathy. Lack of empathy is the inability or unwillingness to feel, recognize, or care about the emotional experiences of others, and it is one of the most revealing psychological weaknesses in dangerous people. At its core, this weakness strips human interaction of its emotional brakes. When someone cannot feel another person's pain, discomfort, or fear, there is nothing internally stopping them from causing harm. Empathy is what makes most people hesitate before crossing moral lines. Without it, those lines barely exist. People who lack empathy often appear cold, calculating, or eerily detached in moments where emotion is expected. They may listen to stories of suffering with empty eyes, respond to distress with irritation, or treat vulnerability as an inconvenience rather than a signal for care. This absence creates an emotional vacuum where manipulation thrives. When you don't emotionally register another person as fully human, they become objects, tools, or obstacles. What makes this weakness especially dangerous is how invisible it can be at first. Many individuals without empathy learn to imitate concern, copying facial expressions, words, or social cues without actually feeling them. This false empathy can be convincing, drawing people in and lowering defenses. Over time, however, cracks appear. The responses feel hollow, comfort feels scripted, pain is minimized or dismissed when it no longer serves their interests. Without empathy, guilt loses its power. Remorse becomes performative. Apologies are used strategically rather than sincerely. This emotional emptiness allows cruelty to be rationalized, exploitation to feel justified, and suffering to be ignored, creating a person who can harm others repeatedly without the internal discomfort that would stop most people. Chronic dishonesty. Chronic dishonesty is the persistent and habitual distortion of truth, where lying becomes a default mode of interaction rather than an occasional act. In dangerous people, this weakness is not driven by fear or self-protection, but by control. Truth threatens predictability, and predictability threatens their ability to manipulate outcomes. By constantly reshaping reality, they remain one step ahead, always adjusting the narrative to suit their needs. What makes chronic dishonesty so unsettling is its emotional impact on others. When someone lies consistently, they erode the basic foundation of human connection: trust. Conversations begin to feel unstable. Memories don't align. Promises shift. Over time, people around them experience confusion, self-doubt, and emotional exhaustion, often questioning their own perception of reality rather than suspecting deception. This psychological fog benefits the dishonest individual, as uncertainty weakens resistance. Chronic liars often lie even when the truth would serve them better. The act itself becomes reinforcing. Each successful deception delivers a sense of power, superiority, and emotional distance. They learn that reality is flexible, that words can override facts, and that consequences can be delayed or avoided if the story is convincing enough. This creates a dangerous feedback loop where lying feels safer than honesty. Emotionally, these individuals tend to lack attachment to truth because truth requires accountability. Lies, on the other hand, offer escape. When confronted, they deflect, deny, or counterattack, making others feel unreasonable for asking simple questions. Over time, relationships with them feel hollow and unstable because nothing rests on solid ground. In a world shaped by chronic dishonesty, reality becomes a weapon, not a shared experience. Grandiosity. Grandiosity is an inflated sense of self-importance that disconnects a person from reality and places them above others in their own mind. In dangerous individuals, this weakness fuels a distorted inner narrative where they are exceptional, superior, or destined for more than ordinary people. They don't just believe they are important, they believe the rules, limits, and consequences that apply to others should not apply to them. Emotionally, grandiosity creates a fragile illusion. The exaggerated self-image must be constantly protected, admired, and reinforced. Any challenge, criticism, or lack of recognition feels like an attack rather than feedback. This is why grandiose individuals react with rage, contempt, or dismissal when they feel overlooked or questioned. Their confidence often looks unshakable on the surface, but underneath it is dependent on external validation. What makes grandiosity dangerous is how it reshapes moral boundaries. When someone believes they are above others, empathy fades and entitlement grows. Other people's needs, limits, and feelings are viewed as secondary or irrelevant. Harm becomes easier to justify because in their mind, their desires carry more weight than anyone else's well-being. Grandiosity also fuels manipulation. These individuals expect admiration and obedience, not mutual respect. They exaggerate achievements, rewrite history, and surround themselves with people who reinforce their inflated self-image. When reality fails to match their internal fantasy, they blame others, systems, or circumstances rather than adjusting their self-perception. This weakness traps them in a cycle of superiority and insecurity. The higher they place themselves, the more threatened they feel by disagreement, equality, or independence in others. Over time, this creates a person who demands loyalty, reacts aggressively to perceived disrespect, and prioritizes their ego over truth, connection, and accountability. Need for dominance. The need for dominance is a compulsive drive to control people, situations, and outcomes in order to feel secure, powerful, and superior. In dangerous individuals, dominance is not about leadership or confidence. It is about hierarchy. They must be above, and someone else must be below. Equality feels threatening because it removes their sense of control and exposes their internal insecurity. Emotionally, this weakness is rooted in fear. When someone relies on dominance, they cannot tolerate unpredictability or independence in others. Autonomy feels like defiance. Disagreement feels like disrespect. Even subtle resistance can trigger hostility because it challenges the position they believe they must maintain to feel safe. Their calm is conditional on obedience. The need for dominance often manifests in small, calculated behaviors long before overt aggression appears. They interrupt, dismiss opinions, impose decisions, and test boundaries to see how much control they can exert. When these tactics work, the behavior intensifies. When they fail, frustration builds and can escalate into intimidation, manipulation, or emotional punishment. What makes this weakness dangerous is how it erodes the autonomy of others. People around dominant individuals often begin to shrink themselves to avoid conflict, slowly surrendering choices, opinions, and boundaries. Over time, this creates a power imbalance where fear replaces mutual respect. Dominance-driven individuals rarely seek connection, they seek compliance. Relationships become arenas where control is maintained rather than bonds where trust is built. Any loss of control feels unbearable, and when dominance slips, they may resort to aggression, coercion, or cruelty to reclaim the sense of power that keeps their inner instability hidden. Fragile ego. A fragile ego is a deeply unstable sense of self that appears confident on the surface but collapses under scrutiny, criticism, or perceived rejection. In dangerous individuals, this weakness creates a constant internal threat response. Their self-worth is not rooted internally. It depends entirely on external validation, admiration, and dominance. When that validation is interrupted, even briefly, the reaction can be intense and disproportionate. Emotionally, a fragile ego cannot tolerate discomfort. Simple feedback feels like humiliation. Disagreement feels like betrayal. Neutral behavior is often interpreted as disrespect. This hypersensitivity turns everyday interactions into emotional landmines, where others must constantly manage tone, words, and reactions to avoid triggering an outburst. Over time, people around them become hyper-aware, walking on emotional glass. What makes a fragile ego especially dangerous is its connection to aggression. When the ego is threatened, the individual may lash out to restore their sense of superiority. This can take the form of ridicule, rage, withdrawal, or revenge. Rather than reflecting or adapting, they attack the source of discomfort, shifting blame outward to protect their self-image. Fragile egos also fuel manipulation. These individuals often exaggerate achievements, deny mistakes, and rewrite events to maintain a flawless image. Admitting fault feels psychologically unbearable, so reality itself must be altered. This creates unstable relationships built on illusion rather than truth. Beneath the defensiveness lies fear of being ordinary, exposed, or insignificant. That fear drives the need to dominate conversations, control narratives, and punish perceived slights. The ego must be protected at all costs, even if it means damaging trust, safety, and the emotional well-being of everyone around them. Inability to accept criticism. The inability to accept criticism is a psychological weakness where feedback is experienced not as information, but as a personal attack. In dangerous individuals, criticism threatens identity rather than behavior. Any suggestion of fault feels like exposure, and exposure feels intolerable. Instead of processing feedback, their mind immediately shifts into defense, denial, or counterattack. Emotionally, this creates a volatile internal state. Even calm, constructive comments can trigger anger, shame, or contempt. Their nervous system reacts as if survival is at stake, flooding them with urgency to protect their self-image. This is why conversations meant to improve understanding often escalate into conflict. The goal is no longer growth, but dominance and self-preservation. People who cannot accept criticism often rewrite events to avoid discomfort. They minimize their actions, shift blame, or accuse others of malicious intent. Over time, this distorts reality. Those around them begin to doubt whether honest communication is even possible. Silence becomes safer than honesty, and avoidance replaces trust. What makes this weakness dangerous is how it shuts down accountability. Without the ability to reflect, mistakes are repeated and escalated. Harmful behaviors are justified rather than corrected. Any attempt to set boundaries is reframed as disrespect or hostility, creating an environment where control replaces collaboration. This trait also fuels emotional manipulation. By reacting strongly to criticism, they train others to self-censor. The outbursts serve a purpose. They condition people to stop challenging them. Over time, this creates an echo chamber where their behavior goes unchecked, their power increases, and the emotional cost is carried entirely by those forced to absorb the consequences of their refusal to listen. Extreme entitlement. Extreme entitlement is the unshakable belief that one deserves special treatment, priority, and rewards regardless of effort, fairness, or impact on others. In dangerous individuals, this weakness distorts reality so deeply that boundaries feel like insults and denial feels like injustice. They don't see privileges as earned, they see them as owed. Emotionally, entitlement creates a volatile inner world. When expectations are instantly met, they feel affirmed and powerful. When they are not, frustration turns into resentment, and resentment quickly mutates into anger. Even minor inconveniences can trigger disproportionate reactions because the individual interprets them as personal violations. The world, in their mind, is constantly failing them. This weakness strips away accountability. Entitled individuals externalize blame, convincing themselves that rules are unfair, people are incompetent, or systems are rigged against them. Because they believe they deserve more than others, empathy erodes. Other people's needs, limits, or suffering become irrelevant when they interfere with what the entitled person wants. Extreme entitlement also fuels exploitation. If they believe they are owed, taking becomes justified, manipulation feels reasonable, crossing boundaries feels necessary. Over time, this creates a pattern where relationships are valued only for what they provide, not for mutual respect or care. What makes entitlement especially dangerous is how it escalates under pressure. When denied repeatedly, the individual may feel humiliated, wronged, or enraged, increasing the likelihood of coercion or retaliation. The belief that they deserve more becomes a moral license to harm, deceive, or dominate, all while feeling deeply convinced they are the victim rather than the threat. Impulsivity. Impulsivity is the inability to pause, reflect, or regulate behavior before acting, and in dangerous individuals, it becomes a critical psychological fault line. At its core, impulsivity is the dominance of immediate emotion over long-term consequence. Feelings rise and action follows instantly without the internal buffer that protects most people from destructive decisions. Anger turns into aggression, desire turns into violation, frustration turns into harm. Emotionally impulsive individuals live at the mercy of their internal storms. They experience urges intensely and lack the capacity to sit with discomfort. Waiting feels unbearable. Restraint feels suffocating. This creates a constant pressure to discharge emotion through action, regardless of the cost to themselves or others. In moments of heightened emotion, logic disappears, and consequence becomes irrelevant. What makes impulsivity especially dangerous is its unpredictability. People around impulsive individuals often feel on edge, never knowing what might trigger an outburst or reckless decision. A small slight can provoke an extreme reaction. A fleeting urge can override years of trust. This instability creates fear because safety relies on consistency, and impulsivity destroys it. Impulsive individuals often regret actions only after damage is done, if at all. Apologies may come, but patterns repeat because the core issue remains unchanged. Over time, they normalize chaos, explaining away harm as just how they are, avoiding responsibility for developing self-control. This weakness also makes manipulation easier. When emotions drive behavior, impulses can be provoked deliberately. Those who understand this can push emotional buttons and steer actions without resistance. Impulsivity turns emotion into a weapon, making the individual both dangerous to others and vulnerable to being controlled through their own unchecked reactions. Poor emotional regulation. Poor emotional regulation is the inability to manage, process, or respond to emotions in a balanced and controlled way. In dangerous individuals, this weakness turns feelings into unchecked reactions. Emotions rise fast, peak hard, and spill outward with little warning. Anger becomes explosive. Frustration turns into hostility. Shame morphs into blame. There is no internal pause between feeling and action. Emotionally, this creates volatility that others can feel immediately. Conversations feel tense, unpredictable, and unsafe. A minor inconvenience can trigger an outsized reaction, leaving people confused about what they did wrong. This instability keeps others on edge, constantly monitoring tone, timing, and words to avoid setting something off. The emotional environment becomes reactive rather than stable. What makes poor emotional regulation dangerous is its link to impulsive harm. When emotions are not regulated internally, they are discharged externally. Yelling, threats, insults, or physical aggression become outlets rather than last resorts. Regret, if it appears at all, comes after damage is already done. The emotional storm always matters more than the consequences. These individuals often justify their reactions by blaming circumstances or other people. "You made me angry" replaces responsibility. This mindset reinforces the behavior because the emotion is treated as uncontrollable and the reaction as inevitable. Over time, emotional outbursts become normalized within their relationships. Poor emotional regulation also fuels manipulation. Sudden mood shifts, emotional explosions, or withdrawal are used to control situations and people. Others learn that keeping the peace means suppressing their own needs. Emotional chaos becomes a tool, allowing the individual's feelings to dominate every interaction while everyone else adapts around their instability. Pathological jealousy. Pathological jealousy is an obsessive and irrational fear of loss, betrayal, or replacement that consumes a person's thoughts and distorts their perception of reality. In dangerous individuals, this weakness is not rooted in love or attachment, but in ownership. Other people are not seen as independent beings with autonomy, but as possessions whose attention, loyalty, and freedom must be monitored and controlled. Emotionally, pathological jealousy feeds on insecurity and fear. Every interaction becomes a potential threat. Neutral behaviors are reinterpreted as suspicious. Innocent delays feel intentional. Ordinary independence feels like abandonment. This constant internal alarm creates a state of hypervigilance where the jealous individual is always searching for evidence to confirm their fears, even when none exists. What makes this weakness especially destructive is how it justifies control. Surveillance, interrogation, emotional pressure, and isolation are reframed as concern or devotion. Boundaries are viewed as secrecy. Privacy is treated as guilt. Over time, the target of this jealousy may begin to shrink their world, avoiding conflict by surrendering friendships, opportunities, and self-expression. Pathological jealousy also erodes reality. Accusations are made with certainty, not proof. Denials are dismissed as lies. Reassurance never lasts, because the emotional hunger driving the jealousy cannot be satisfied. Each perceived slight reinforces the belief that control must increase. This weakness is dangerous because it escalates. When reassurance fails and control feels threatened, jealousy can transform into rage, punishment, or coercion. The fear of loss becomes more powerful than empathy, logic, or restraint, creating a mindset where harming the other person feels justified if it restores a sense of control and emotional certainty. Blame shifting. Blame shifting is the habitual refusal to accept responsibility, where fault is constantly redirected onto others, circumstances, or unseen forces. In dangerous individuals, this weakness functions as a psychological shield that protects their self-image at all costs. Admitting fault would mean confronting guilt, shame, or inadequacy, so reality must be rearranged to ensure they are never the one at fault. Emotionally, blame shifting destabilizes everyone around them. Conversations become exhausting loops where facts are twisted, timelines altered, and intentions rewritten. What begins as a simple issue slowly turns into confusion, self-doubt, and emotional erosion for the other person. Victims often find themselves apologizing for things they didn't do, questioning their memory, or feeling responsible for outcomes they never controlled. This weakness thrives on emotional deflection. When confronted, the blame shifter responds with counter-accusations, emotional outbursts, or moral outrage. The goal is not resolution, but escape. By overwhelming the situation with emotion or distraction, they avoid accountability while placing the psychological burden onto someone else. Over time, blame shifting creates an environment where problems are never solved, only reassigned. Mistakes repeat, harm continues. Growth becomes impossible because responsibility is the doorway to change, and that doorway remains permanently closed. The individual remains psychologically stagnant while damage accumulates around them. What makes blame shifting especially dangerous is how it corrodes trust and safety. When someone knows they will never be held accountable, boundaries lose meaning. Apologies lose sincerity. Harm becomes cyclical. The absence of responsibility allows manipulation, cruelty, and neglect to continue unchecked, all while the blame shifter maintains the illusion of innocence and moral superiority. Refusal to take responsibility. Refusal to take responsibility is the persistent rejection of accountability for one's actions, choices, and their impact on others. In dangerous individuals, this weakness functions as psychological armor. Accepting responsibility would require self-examination, guilt, and change, so instead, blame is pushed outward. Someone else is always at fault. Circumstances are always unfair. The system, the past, or other people become convenient shields against self-awareness. Emotionally, this creates a distorted reality where the individual is always the victim, never the cause. Even when harm is obvious, they minimize, justify, or deny it. Apologies, if offered, feel empty because they are framed around consequences rather than responsibility. "I'm sorry you feel that way" replaces genuine remorse. This protects their self-image while leaving others carrying the emotional damage. What makes this weakness dangerous is how it enables repeated harm. When responsibility is avoided, learning never occurs. Patterns repeat because nothing is owned. Each conflict becomes proof that others are unreasonable, disloyal, or incompetent. Over time, people around them begin to feel unheard and invalidated, as if their pain doesn't count unless it serves the individual's narrative. This refusal also erodes trust. Healthy relationships rely on repair, and repair requires accountability. Without it, wounds remain open, frustration builds, anger festers. The individual becomes increasingly isolated, yet interprets that isolation as further evidence that others are the problem. By rejecting responsibility, they remain emotionally stagnant, protected from guilt, but trapped in the same destructive cycles. The inability to say, "I did this," ensures that damage continues, unchecked and unresolved. Manipulativeness. Manipulativeness is the calculated use of influence, deception, and emotional leverage to control others while maintaining the appearance of innocence or good intent. In dangerous individuals, this weakness is rooted in the belief that directness is unnecessary and honesty is a liability. Instead of asking, they maneuver. Instead of connecting, they position. Every interaction becomes a quiet negotiation for advantage. Emotionally, manipulative people are highly attuned to vulnerabilities, not to protect them, but to exploit them. They listen closely, remember insecurities, fears, and desires, and store them for later use. Kindness is offered conditionally. Affection is used as currency. Guilt, fear, and obligation become invisible strings pulled when compliance is needed. What makes manipulativeness especially dangerous is how subtle it feels to the person experiencing it. There is rarely a clear moment of harm. Instead, confusion accumulates. You feel pressured without knowing why. You feel responsible for emotions that are not yours. You begin to doubt your instincts because the manipulator frames their control as care, concern, or logic. Manipulative individuals often avoid overt force because influence feels cleaner and safer. They present themselves as victims, saviors, or misunderstood allies depending on what grants the most control. When confronted, they deflect, minimize, or reverse blame, making others feel unreasonable for questioning them. Over time, relationships with manipulative people drain clarity and autonomy. Decisions no longer feel freely chosen. Boundaries erode quietly. The greatest damage lies not in a single act, but in the slow reshaping of another person's reality until control feels normal and resistance feels wrong. Shallow emotions. Shallow emotions refer to an impaired or limited depth of emotional experience, where feelings exist only on the surface and lack intensity, complexity, or lasting impact. In dangerous individuals, this weakness creates an emotional emptiness that is often mistaken for calmness, confidence, or emotional strength. In reality, it reflects a reduced capacity to truly feel joy, sadness, love, or guilt in a way that meaningfully guides behavior. Emotionally, people with shallow emotions may react appropriately in the moment, but quickly disconnect once the situation passes. Their responses appear correct, yet something feels missing. Compassion fades fast. Regret doesn't linger. Pain, whether their own or someone else's, fails to leave a lasting impression. This makes their emotional reactions unreliable and difficult to trust. What makes shallow emotions particularly dangerous is how they weaken moral restraint. Deep emotions anchor empathy, attachment, and responsibility. When those emotions are thin, actions carry less emotional weight. Hurting someone may register intellectually, but it does not resonate emotionally. Without that internal echo, there is little motivation to change behavior or repair harm. Shallow emotions also enable manipulation. These individuals can mimic emotional responses without being affected by them. They may express affection, remorse, or concern convincingly, but those expressions are fleeting and easily abandoned when inconvenient. This creates confusion for others who sense inconsistency but struggle to explain it. Over time, relationships with emotionally shallow individuals feel hollow and draining. Intimacy never deepens, trust never fully forms, and emotional exchanges feel one-sided. The absence of emotional depth allows them to detach easily, move on without remorse, and repeat harmful patterns without the emotional friction that stops most people from crossing the same lines again. Exploitation of others. Exploitation of others is the tendency to view people not as individuals with needs and boundaries, but as resources to be used, drained, and discarded. In dangerous individuals, this weakness rewires human connection into a transaction where value is measured only by usefulness. Kindness becomes leverage, trust becomes access, vulnerability becomes opportunity. Emotionally, exploitation feels violating because it operates beneath the surface. The exploiter often appears charming, attentive, or supportive at first, creating a sense of safety that lowers defenses. This initial warmth is not rooted in care, but in calculation. They study what others need, fear, or desire, then position themselves as the solution, only to extract time, loyalty, money, labor, or emotional energy in return. What makes this weakness especially disturbing is the absence of emotional reciprocity. Exploitative individuals take without replenishing. They lean without supporting. When confronted with the damage they cause, they respond with indifference, minimization, or justification. Other people's exhaustion, confusion, or pain barely registers unless it threatens continued access. Over time, those around an exploiter begin to feel drained and diminished. Boundaries erode because saying no is met with guilt, pressure, or subtle punishment. The relationship becomes one-sided, yet difficult to leave because the exploiter has carefully intertwined themselves with the other person's sense of responsibility or self-worth. Exploitation thrives where empathy is absent and entitlement is strong. People are reduced to roles, functions, or stepping stones. Once usefulness ends, emotional attachment vanishes, revealing the chilling reality that connection was never the goal, control and gain were. Lack of remorse. Lack of remorse is the absence of genuine emotional pain after causing harm, and it is one of the clearest signals of a dangerous psychological disconnect. Remorse is what slows most people down after they hurt someone. It creates discomfort, regret, and a desire to repair. When that internal response is missing, harm leaves no emotional mark, making repetition easy and restraint unnecessary. Emotionally, individuals without remorse may acknowledge that something happened, but they do not feel the weight of it. They can describe events calmly, even coldly, while others are still processing the damage. Apologies, if given, are strategic rather than heartfelt. They are offered to end conflict, regain access, or restore an image, not because the suffering of another person truly matters to them. What makes this weakness especially unsettling is how normal it can appear on the surface. A lack of remorse does not always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like indifference, impatience, or irritation that others are still upset. The emotional imbalance becomes clear when pain is treated as an inconvenience rather than a consequence. Without remorse, moral boundaries weaken. There is no internal cost to crossing lines, so decisions are guided by benefit rather than ethics. Harm becomes just another outcome, not a warning sign. Over time, this detachment allows increasingly severe behavior because nothing inside pushes back. For those around them, the absence of remorse is deeply destabilizing. It signals that no amount of hurt will create change. There is no internal break, no emotional reckoning, only a void where conscience should be, allowing damage to continue without resistance. Aggression when challenged. Aggression when challenged is the instinctive shift to hostility whenever authority, competence, or self-image is questioned. In dangerous individuals, challenge is not perceived as dialogue or disagreement, but as threat. The moment their ideas, actions, or position are scrutinized, their nervous system moves into attack mode, prioritizing dominance over understanding. Emotionally, this reaction is driven by insecurity masked as strength. Being questioned exposes doubt, and doubt feels intolerable. Rather than risk feeling inferior, they escalate. Voices rise, body language hardens, words sharpen. The goal is not to resolve the issue, but to overpower it, silencing the source of discomfort as quickly as possible. This weakness creates an atmosphere of fear. People learn that asking questions has consequences, offering feedback becomes risky. Even neutral clarification can provoke anger. Over time, those around them stop challenging anything at all, allowing harmful behaviors, poor decisions, and distorted beliefs to go unchecked. Aggression becomes a protective shield against accountability. What makes this trait especially dangerous is its speed. There is little warning and no gradual buildup. The switch from calm to hostile is abrupt, catching others off guard and destabilizing the interaction. The aggression may be verbal, emotional, or physical, but its function is the same: regain control and reassert superiority. Aggression, when challenged, also reinforces isolation. Instead of learning, adapting, or self-correcting, the individual drives people away or forces them into submission. The world becomes divided into those who comply and those who are enemies, creating a mindset where power replaces dialogue and intimidation replaces truth. Obsession with control. Obsession with control is a psychological fixation on managing people, outcomes, and environments to eliminate uncertainty and emotional discomfort. In dangerous individuals, control is not a preference, but a necessity. Without it, they feel exposed, powerless, and internally chaotic. Control becomes the mechanism through which they regulate their emotions, creating the illusion of stability by restricting the freedom of others. Emotionally, this obsession is driven by fear rather than strength. Unpredictability feels intolerable. Spontaneity feels threatening. Other people's independence triggers anxiety because it introduces variables they cannot manage. To soothe this anxiety, they impose rules, expectations, and constraints, often disguising control as responsibility, concern, or leadership. What makes this weakness especially damaging is how gradually it escalates. It often begins with small interventions, monitoring decisions, correcting behavior, dictating routines. When these measures succeed, the need for control intensifies. When they fail, frustration turns into coercion, emotional pressure, or punishment. Control must increase to restore the sense of safety it provides. An obsession with control erodes trust and autonomy. People around such individuals learn that peace exists only through compliance. Over time, they may abandon their preferences, silence their needs, and second-guess their judgment to avoid conflict. This creates a dynamic where control replaces connection. The most dangerous aspect of this weakness is how it justifies harm. When control feels threatened, empathy disappears. The priority shifts from mutual respect to dominance and certainty. In this state, Manipulation, intimidation, and emotional cruelty feel necessary, even reasonable, as long as they restore the illusion of order and emotional security the controlling individual depends on. Paranoia. Paranoia is a persistent state of mistrust where the mind is constantly scanning for threats, betrayal, or hidden motives that often do not exist. In dangerous individuals, this weakness distorts perception so deeply that reality feels hostile and people feel unsafe by default. Neutral actions are reinterpreted as attacks. Silence becomes suspicious. Disagreement becomes evidence of conspiracy. Emotionally, paranoia keeps the nervous system in a state of chronic alert. The individual feels perpetually targeted, watched, or undermined, which fuels anxiety and resentment. This internal pressure seeks release, often through accusation, control, or preemptive aggression. If everyone is a potential enemy, striking first begins to feel like self-defense. What makes paranoia especially destabilizing is its self-reinforcing nature. The more someone suspects others, the more they behave defensively or aggressively, provoking fear or distance in return. That reaction is then used as proof that the suspicion was justified. Over time, this cycle hardens into a worldview where trust feels dangerous and vulnerability feels foolish. Paranoid individuals often interrogate intentions rather than listen to words. They fixate on tone, timing, and imagine subtext, reading meaning where none was intended. This creates exhausting relationships where reassurance never lasts because the fear is internal and cannot be satisfied by external evidence. As paranoia intensifies, empathy erodes. Other people's perspectives are dismissed as lies or manipulation. Accountability feels threatening because it implies the problem might not be external. In its most dangerous form, paranoia grants moral permission to isolate, dominate, or harm others under the belief that it is necessary for survival. Vindictiveness. Vindictiveness is the compulsive need to retaliate, punish, or emotionally wound those perceived as having caused offense, injury, or disrespect. In dangerous individuals, this weakness transforms perceived slights into long-lasting emotional debts that must be repaid. Forgiveness feels like weakness, and letting go feels like losing power. Pain must be answered with pain, or the internal sense of balance feels threatened. Emotionally, vindictive people live with a heightened sensitivity to offense. Small disagreements are remembered vividly, replayed, and emotionally magnified over time. The original event becomes less important than the emotional narrative built around it. They feel wronged, humiliated, or diminished, and revenge becomes a way to restore their sense of control and self-worth. What makes vindictiveness dangerous is its patience. Unlike impulsive anger, vindictiveness can be cold and delayed. The individual may appear calm, cooperative, or even forgiving on the surface while internally tracking grievances. Retaliation is often calculated, timed to inflict maximum emotional damage rather than immediate release. This weakness poisons relationships from the inside. Trust erodes when people sense that mistakes are never truly forgiven, only stored for later use. Others begin to censor themselves, walking carefully to avoid triggering future retaliation. The emotional atmosphere becomes tense and unsafe. Vindictiveness also traps the individual in a cycle of resentment. Instead of processing pain and moving forward, they remain anchored to past injuries. This fixation keeps anger alive long after the moment has passed, shaping decisions and behavior through bitterness rather than clarity. In this state, harming others feels justified, even necessary, because revenge becomes mistaken for justice. Inconsistent moral standards. Inconsistent moral standards refer to the selective and shifting application of right and wrong depending on what benefits the individual in the moment. In dangerous people, morality is not an internal compass, but a flexible tool. Rules matter when they protect them, and principles matter only when they can be used to judge or control others. The same behavior can be condemned one day and justified the next without any sense of contradiction. Emotionally, this creates deep confusion for those around them. You never know which version of their values you are dealing with. What was once unacceptable suddenly becomes reasonable when they are the one doing it. This unpredictability erodes trust because consistency is what allows people to feel safe and grounded in relationships. What makes this weakness dangerous is how it removes accountability. When morals shift, responsibility disappears. Harmful actions are reframed as necessary, deserved, or misunderstood. When confronted, they rely on rationalizations rather than remorse, twisting logic to protect their self-image instead of addressing the damage done. Inconsistent moral standards also enable manipulation. By changing the rules, they keep others off balance. People spend energy trying to understand what is expected, often blaming themselves for violating standards that were never stable to begin with. This imbalance gives the individual power, as confusion weakens resistance. Over time, this trait creates an environment where fairness feels impossible. Equality does not exist because standards are not shared. Morality becomes performative, used to shame, justify, or dominate rather than guide behavior. In such a dynamic, harm is easy to excuse, and trust slowly collapses under the weight of contradiction. Hypersensitivity to disrespect. Hypersensitivity to disrespect is an exaggerated and often distorted perception of being insulted, diminished, or challenged, even in neutral or ambiguous situations. In dangerous individuals, this weakness turns everyday interactions into perceived power struggles. Tone, facial expressions, silence, or harmless disagreement are interpreted as intentional slights that must be addressed, corrected, or punished. Emotionally, this hypersensitivity is fueled by insecurity and ego fragility. The individual's sense of worth is tightly bound to how others treat them, making external validation essential for emotional stability. When respect is not overtly displayed, their nervous system reacts with threat responses such as anger, defensiveness, or hostility. The reaction is often immediate and intense, leaving little room for reflection. What makes this weakness especially volatile is how it drives escalation. Minor incidents become symbolic battles for status and dominance. Rather than clarifying intent, the individual assumes malice. Apologies are viewed as insufficient, explanations as excuses. The emotional response is not proportional to the event, but to the internal fear of being diminished. This hypersensitivity often trains others to self-censor. People become cautious with words, humor, and even silence, knowing that misinterpretation can trigger conflict. Over time, this creates an environment of tension where authenticity disappears and fear replaces openness. When combined with power or control, hypersensitivity to disrespect becomes dangerous. Any perceived slight justifies retaliation, intimidation, or emotional punishment. The need to restore perceived status overrides empathy and reason, turning ordinary interactions into flashpoints where maintaining dominance becomes more important than understanding truth or preserving connection. Chronic anger. Chronic anger is a persistent emotional state where irritation, hostility, and resentment sit just beneath the surface, waiting for a trigger. In dangerous individuals, anger is not a reaction to specific events, but a lens through which the world is perceived. Life feels unfair, people feel incompetent or disrespectful, and frustration becomes a constant background noise. Emotionally, chronic anger creates internal pressure that seeks release. Small inconveniences feel intolerable. Minor disagreements feel provocative. The individual experiences a near-constant sense of being wronged, overlooked, or challenged. This makes emotional regulation difficult, as the nervous system is already primed for conflict before anything even happens. What makes this weakness dangerous is its unpredictability. Others never know which comment, tone, or delay will ignite an outburst. This creates an environment of tension where people walk on eggshells, adjusting their behavior to avoid triggering rage. Over time, fear replaces openness and silence replaces honesty. Chronic anger also narrows perception. When someone is consistently angry, nuance disappears. Intentions are interpreted as hostile, mistakes are seen as personal attacks, and empathy is drowned out by irritation. This emotional rigidity makes reflection nearly impossible because anger feels justified and necessary rather than destructive. Over time, anger becomes self-reinforcing. Outbursts push people away, isolation grows, and resentment deepens, confirming the belief that the world is against them. Without relief, anger hardens into identity, turning the individual into someone who reacts with hostility before understanding and punishes before listening. Deceptive charm. Deceptive charm is the ability to appear warm, engaging, and trustworthy while concealing manipulative or harmful intentions beneath the surface. In dangerous individuals, charm is not an expression of genuine connection. It is a social weapon. It is used to lower defenses, create emotional attachment, and gain access to people who would otherwise keep their distance. Emotionally, deceptive charm feels disarming. The person seems attentive, confident, and unusually attuned to others. Conversations flow easily. Compliments feel personal. Attention feels flattering. This emotional pull creates a sense of safety and familiarity that encourages trust to form quickly, often faster than it should. People feel seen, understood, and valued, sometimes for the first time in a long while. What makes this weakness dangerous is its intentionality. Deceptive charm is adaptive. It shifts depending on the audience, mirroring values, humor, and emotional tone to create instant rapport. The charm fades or hardens once trust is secured or when compliance is no longer needed. The warmth was never the core personality. It was a tool. Over time, inconsistencies appear. Kindness becomes conditional. Affection is withdrawn as punishment. The charming exterior gives way to indifference, entitlement, or control. Victims often struggle to reconcile these two versions, blaming themselves for the shift rather than recognizing the deception. Deceptive charm exploits a deep human vulnerability, the desire to be liked and understood. By using warmth without sincerity, the individual bypasses critical judgment and emotional caution, allowing manipulation to take root long before danger is recognized. Emotional coldness. Emotional coldness is the persistent absence of warmth, emotional responsiveness, and genuine emotional engagement with others. In dangerous individuals, this weakness creates a chilling distance that makes connection feel one-sided and unsafe. Emotions are acknowledged intellectually, if at all, but rarely felt or shared. Human experiences that usually evoke concern, compassion, or closeness are met with indifference or detachment. Emotionally, this coldness leaves others feeling unseen and unimportant. Attempts to connect are met with flat responses, delayed reactions, or subtle dismissal. Vulnerability feels wasted in their presence, as emotional expressions seem to fall into empty space. Over time, people begin to suppress their own feelings, learning that emotional needs will not be met and may even be punished with withdrawal or contempt. What makes emotional coldness dangerous is how it removes natural emotional restraints. Without warmth or emotional resonance, causing pain does not feel significant. Discomfort in others does not register as something urgent or meaningful. This detachment allows harmful behavior to occur without internal conflict because emotional consequences are not fully processed. Emotionally cold individuals often rely on logic, control, or superiority to navigate relationships. They may frame emotions as weakness, inconvenience, or manipulation, positioning themselves as above emotional influence. This dynamic creates imbalance, where one person reaches and the other withholds. Over time, emotional coldness becomes a form of power. Withholding affection, empathy, or reassurance creates dependency and insecurity in others. The absence itself becomes a weapon, making people work harder for connection that never fully arrives, while the emotionally cold individual remains unaffected and in control. Disregard for boundaries. Disregard for boundaries is the inability or refusal to recognize, respect, or honor the physical, emotional, and psychological limits of others. In dangerous individuals, boundaries are not seen as expressions of autonomy, but as obstacles to access and control. When someone asserts a limit, it is interpreted not as self-protection, but as rejection, defiance, or a challenge to authority. Emotionally, this weakness is driven by entitlement. The individual believes their needs, curiosity, or desires justify intrusion. Privacy feels unnecessary. Consent feels negotiable. Emotional space feels like distance that must be closed. This mindset allows them to push, probe, and invade without registering discomfort as a signal to stop. What makes this behavior especially harmful is how subtle it can begin. Small intrusions are framed as jokes, concern, or closeness. Personal questions are asked too soon. Time, space, or emotional availability are assumed rather than requested. When these violations go unchallenged, the individual learns that boundaries can be crossed without consequence, encouraging escalation. Disregard for boundaries erodes a person's sense of safety. Those on the receiving end often feel pressured to justify their limits, apologize for asserting them, or abandon them altogether to maintain peace. Over time, this creates confusion, self-doubt, and emotional exhaustion. When confronted, individuals who disregard boundaries often react with anger, dismissal, or guilt-inducing tactics. Respecting limits would require empathy and self-restraint, qualities they lack or reject. The inability to tolerate no turns relationships into arenas of control, where persistence replaces respect and intrusion becomes normalized as long as it serves their sense of entitlement. Pleasure in others' discomfort. Pleasure in others' discomfort is the disturbing tendency to feel satisfaction, amusement, or emotional reward when someone else feels uneasy, embarrassed, afraid, or hurt. In dangerous individuals, this weakness reveals a deep rupture in emotional wiring, where another person's distress becomes a source of stimulation rather than concern. Discomfort is not something to alleviate, it is something to provoke and enjoy. Emotionally, this trait feeds on power. Causing discomfort creates a sense of control, superiority, and dominance. A subtle insult, an awkward silence, a public humiliation, or a calculated push past someone's boundaries becomes a way to assert influence. The reaction itself is the reward. Seeing discomfort confirms their ability to affect others, to intrude into emotional space without consequence. What makes this especially unsettling is how quietly it often operates. It may appear as jokes, passive-aggressive remarks, intentional misunderstandings, or boundary violations framed as accidents. The individual watches closely, studying reactions, lingering on moments of visible unease. Empathy does not interrupt the behavior. It never activates in the first place. Over time, those around such a person begin to feel tense and hyper-aware. They sense that vulnerability will be used against them, that discomfort is not a mistake, but a goal. This erodes safety at a fundamental level. People become guarded, self-silencing, and anxious without always understanding why. This weakness reflects an emotional emptiness where connection is replaced by domination. Instead of bonding through understanding, the individual bonds to the feeling of being above, untouched, and in control, even if it means feeding on the quiet suffering of others. Compulsive lying. Compulsive lying is the uncontrollable urge to fabricate, exaggerate, or distort reality even when there is no clear benefit in doing so. In dangerous individuals, lying is not a strategy used sparingly. It is an ingrained behavior that shapes how they interact with the world. Truth feels restrictive, while lies feel freeing, allowing them to continuously rewrite who they are, what they've done, and how others perceive them. Emotionally, compulsive liars live in a constant state of performance. They are always managing impressions, tracking stories, and adjusting details to maintain control of the narrative. This creates a strange emotional detachment from reality. Facts lose meaning, and consistency becomes irrelevant. The lie itself becomes more important than accuracy because it preserves their internal sense of control. What makes compulsive lying especially destabilizing is its frequency. Lies appear in small, unnecessary moments, making conversations feel subtly off. Stories don't align. Details change. When confronted, the liar often responds with denial, confusion, or counteraccusations, causing others to doubt their own memory and perception. Over time, this erodes psychological stability in those around them. Compulsive lying also removes accountability. If reality can always be rewritten, consequences never fully land. Mistakes can be erased with a new story. Harm can be minimized or denied outright. This allows destructive behavior to continue unchecked, protected by layers of deception. Relationships with compulsive liars feel exhausting and unsafe. Trust cannot take root because nothing feels solid. In this environment, truth becomes optional, reality becomes fluid, and manipulation thrives in the space where honesty should exist. Inability to maintain long-term relationships. The inability to maintain long-term relationships is a pattern of repeated relational breakdowns where closeness consistently turns into conflict, distance, or abandonment. In dangerous individuals, this weakness is not caused by bad luck or mismatched personalities, but by unresolved internal patterns that sabotage stability. Intimacy exposes flaws, demands accountability, and requires emotional reciprocity, things they struggle to sustain. Emotionally, relationships with these individuals often begin intensely. Charm, attention, and connection are strong in the early stages, creating the illusion of depth. Over time, however, cracks emerge. Boundaries are tested, control replaces cooperation, empathy fades. The relationship becomes emotionally draining rather than supportive, pushing others into confusion or self-doubt. What makes this weakness dangerous is the cycle it creates. When relationships fail, the individual rarely self-reflects. Instead, blame is externalized. Every former partner, friend, or ally is labeled unreasonable, disloyal, or flawed. This narrative protects their self-image while preventing growth, ensuring the pattern repeats with new people. The inability to sustain long-term bonds also fuels instability. Without consistent relationships, there are fewer people to challenge behavior, offer grounding feedback, or hold them accountable. Isolation becomes normalized, and transactional connections replace genuine attachment. Emotionally, this pattern leaves a trail of unresolved harm. People exit feeling confused, diminished, or emotionally depleted. For the individual, each failed relationship reinforces defensiveness and mistrust, deepening the very traits that caused the breakdown. Over time, relationships are no longer spaces of connection, but temporary arrangements that collapse once real emotional demands appear. Lack of accountability. Lack of accountability is the refusal or inability to acknowledge responsibility for one's actions, choices, and their impact on others. In dangerous individuals, this weakness acts as a psychological shield, protecting their self-image at the expense of truth. Mistakes are never owned. They are redirected, reframed, or denied altogether. Responsibility is always external, and fault must belong to someone else. Emotionally, accountability feels threatening because it requires self-reflection and humility. For someone who lacks it, admitting wrongdoing triggers shame, fear, or a sense of weakness. To avoid this discomfort, They construct narratives where circumstances, misunderstandings, or other people are to blame. Over time, reality becomes distorted, and consequences feel unfair rather than earned. What makes this weakness especially damaging is how it enables repeated harm. Without accountability, there is no learning. Patterns continue unchecked because nothing is ever internalized. Apologies, if offered, are empty and strategic, designed to diffuse tension rather than repair damage. Change is promised but never embodied, because acknowledging fault would require emotional ownership they cannot tolerate. This trait also erodes trust. People around them realize that honesty leads nowhere and resolution is impossible. Conflicts loop endlessly because responsibility is never accepted. Eventually, others either carry the blame themselves or disengage entirely to protect their emotional well-being. Lack of accountability creates a dangerous imbalance. The individual retains power without consequence, while others absorb the emotional and practical fallout. Over time, this dynamic normalizes injustice. Harm is minimized, victims are questioned, and truth is treated as negotiable, allowing destructive behavior to persist under the protection of denial and self-justification. Excessive need for admiration. Excessive need for admiration is a relentless hunger for validation, praise, and recognition that goes far beyond healthy affirmation. In dangerous individuals, admiration is not appreciated, it is required. Their sense of self does not exist independently, so it must be constantly reflected back to them through attention, approval, and admiration from others. Without it, they feel empty, agitated, or invisible. Emotionally, this weakness creates dependency disguised as confidence. The individual may appear charismatic, accomplished, or self-assured, but their stability is fragile and externally fueled. Compliments act like oxygen. Attention soothes inner insecurity. When admiration flows, they feel powerful and alive. When it stops, irritation, envy, or hostility quickly surfaces. What makes this need dangerous is how it shapes behavior. Conversations become performances, relationships become stages. Other people are valued less for who they are and more for how well they provide validation. If someone fails to admire them enough, that person is subtly devalued, dismissed, or punished through withdrawal or criticism. Over time, admiration is no longer enough unless it escalates. Praise must be louder, loyalty more visible, agreement more absolute. Neutrality feels like rejection. Independence in others feels threatening because it shifts attention away from them. This often leads to manipulation, exaggeration, or emotional pressure designed to pull focus back where they believe it belongs. At its core, excessive need for admiration reveals an unstable identity propped up by external applause. When admiration fades, the mask slips, exposing resentment, insecurity, and a readiness to undermine anyone who no longer feeds the image they are desperate to maintain. Gaslighting behavior. Gaslighting behavior is the deliberate distortion of another person's perception of reality in order to gain control, dominance, or emotional leverage. In dangerous individuals, this weakness is not accidental misunderstanding. It is an intentional psychological strategy. The goal is not to win an argument, but to destabilize the other person's sense of certainty until they no longer trust their own thoughts, memories, or emotions. Emotionally, gaslighting is deeply disorienting. It begins subtly. Events are denied. Words are reinterpreted. Feelings are dismissed as overreactions. The individual insists that what happened didn't happen, or that it happened differently than remembered. Over time, this constant contradiction creates confusion and self-doubt. The victim begins to question their own judgment, wondering if they are too sensitive, too emotional, or simply wrong. What makes gaslighting especially dangerous is its cumulative effect. Each small denial chips away at confidence. Each dismissal weakens emotional stability. Eventually, the person being gaslit may rely on the gaslighter to define reality for them, asking for validation before trusting their own experience. This creates a powerful imbalance where control is maintained through psychological erosion rather than force. Gaslighters often present themselves as calm, logical, or reasonable, framing the other person as irrational or unstable. This contrast further isolates the victim, making them hesitant to seek outside support for fear of being seen as confused or dramatic. Gaslighting traps people in their own minds. It turns reality into a moving target and self-trust into a liability. In this distorted environment, resistance fades, dependence grows, and the gaslighter gains power not by strength, but by systematically dismantling another person's grip on reality. Low frustration tolerance. Low frustration tolerance is the inability to endure discomfort, delay, obstacles, or unmet expectations without becoming emotionally overwhelmed. In dangerous individuals, this weakness turns everyday resistance into a psychological threat. Waiting feels insulting. Obstacles feel personal. Any interruption between desire and fulfillment creates internal pressure that demands immediate release. Emotionally, this manifests as irritability that escalates fast and without proportion. Small inconveniences trigger outsized reactions because patience requires emotional regulation they do not possess. The internal message is simple and urgent. Discomfort must stop now. This urgency overrides logic, empathy, and long-term thinking, making their reactions feel sudden and unstable to others. What makes low frustration tolerance dangerous is its link to impulsive behavior. When frustration cannot be tolerated, it must be discharged. Anger, verbal attacks, intimidation, or reckless decisions become coping mechanisms. The relief that follows reinforces the behavior, teaching the individual that emotional pressure is solved through explosion rather than endurance. People around them quickly adapt. They rush to meet demands, smooth obstacles, and avoid delays to keep the peace. Over time, this teaches the individual that intolerance works. The world begins to bend around their emotional limits, increasing entitlement and decreasing resilience even further. Low frustration tolerance also distorts perception. Neutral barriers are interpreted as disrespect. Delays feel like rejection. Limits feel like control. This mindset keeps the nervous system in a constant state of agitation, where frustration is expected and hostility is always close. As tolerance shrinks, aggression grows. The individual becomes increasingly unable to coexist with reality as it is, requiring constant accommodation from others while reacting harshly whenever the world fails to comply with their emotional demands. Inability to delay gratification. Inability to delay gratification is the compulsive need to satisfy desires immediately, regardless of long-term consequences or harm to others. In dangerous individuals, this weakness reflects a failure of internal restraint. Impulses are experienced as urgent demands rather than choices, and any discomfort associated with waiting feels intolerable. The present moment dominates their decision-making, while the future barely registers. Emotionally, this creates a state of constant tension. Desire, frustration, and entitlement collide, producing impulsive behavior driven by urgency rather than reflection. When wants are blocked, irritation quickly turns into anger or resentment. Limits feel oppressive. Rules feel unnecessary. The emotional message is simple and powerful. If something feels good now, it must be pursued now. What makes this weakness particularly risky is how it overrides moral judgment. Consequences are intellectually acknowledged but emotionally discounted. Harm becomes an abstract concept compared to the immediate relief or pleasure of acting. This allows individuals to justify reckless decisions, broken promises, and exploitative behavior without experiencing meaningful guilt. In relationships, inability to delay gratification erodes trust. Commitments are sacrificed for impulse. Stability is replaced by unpredictability. Others are left managing the fallout of choices made in moments of emotional urgency. Over time, people around them feel unsafe, knowing that desire will always outrank responsibility. This trait also fuels manipulation. When immediate satisfaction is blocked, pressure increases. They may coerce, guilt, or intimidate others to remove obstacles standing between them and what they want. The discomfort of waiting feels unbearable, and that discomfort is displaced onto others, turning impulsivity into a source of emotional and relational damage. Contempt for rules. Contempt for rules is a deep-seated belief that guidelines, laws, and boundaries are meant for other people, not for oneself. In dangerous individuals, this weakness reflects a rejection of shared social limits and an inflated sense of exceptionality. Rules are not seen as protections or structures, but as obstacles to personal desire and control. Emotionally, this contempt is fueled by entitlement and defiance. Being told no triggers irritation rather than reflection. Restrictions feel humiliating. Compliance feels like weakness. The individual experiences rules as an attack on their autonomy, responding with dismissal, mockery, or quiet defiance. Breaking rules becomes emotionally satisfying because it reinforces their sense of superiority. What makes this weakness especially dangerous is how it erodes accountability. When rules are optional, consequences feel negotiable. The individual begins to test limits, pushing further each time without internal restraint. Small violations escalate into larger ones because nothing inside signals when to stop. If they succeed without immediate consequences, the behavior is reinforced. Contempt for rules also destabilizes those around them. Others are pressured to bend standards, cover mistakes, or ignore violations to avoid conflict. Over time, this creates an environment where fairness collapses and safety deteriorates, replaced by unpredictability and fear. At its core, this weakness reflects a refusal to coexist within shared reality. Rules represent equality, restraint, and mutual responsibility. By rejecting them, the individual places themselves above the collective, justifying harm, manipulation, or recklessness as personal freedom rather than recognizing it as a threat to everyone else. Predatory mindset. A predatory mindset is the perception of people as targets rather than individuals, and interactions as opportunities rather than relationships. In dangerous individuals, this weakness creates a constant scanning of the environment for advantage. They assess vulnerability, power gaps, emotional needs, and weaknesses with quiet precision. Empathy is replaced by strategy, and connection is replaced by calculation. Emotionally, this mindset is detached and self-serving. Others are valued only for what they can provide: access, status, resources, compliance, or stimulation. Vulnerability is not met with care, but with interest. Trust is not honored, but exploited. The emotional world of others becomes a map of pressure points to be used when needed. What makes a predatory mindset especially disturbing is how normal it can appear. These individuals often blend in seamlessly, mimicking social norms, values, and emotions well enough to avoid detection. Beneath the surface, however, every interaction is measured. Boundaries are tested subtly. Reactions are observed closely. Each response provides data. This weakness thrives on imbalance. Predatory individuals seek situations where they hold psychological, emotional, or social power. They are drawn to uncertainty, insecurity, and dependency because these states reduce resistance. Once leverage is established, behavior escalates, often gradually, to avoid triggering alarm. For those caught in a predatory dynamic, the experience is deeply violating. They sense something is wrong but struggle to articulate it. The danger lies not in overt aggression at first, but in the slow, deliberate erosion of safety. In a predatory mindset, harm is not accidental. It is anticipated, planned, and justified as entitlement. Absence of guilt. The absence of guilt is the inability to experience internal discomfort after causing harm, violating trust, or crossing moral boundaries. In dangerous individuals, this weakness removes one of the most important psychological safeguards against destructive behavior. Guilt is what forces reflection, repair, and restraint. Without it, actions exist without emotional consequence. Emotionally, people with no guilt can harm others and remain calm, detached, or even justified. They may acknowledge events intellectually while feeling nothing internally. Pain they cause is treated as irrelevant, exaggerated, or deserved. This emotional emptiness makes their behavior especially unsettling because there is no visible struggle or remorse to signal awareness of wrongdoing. What makes the absence of guilt dangerous is how it enables repetition. When harm does not create internal discomfort, there is no reason to change. Apologies, if offered, are strategic rather than sincere, used to manage perception or regain access rather than to repair damage. Words replace accountability, and behavior remains unchanged. This trait also distorts power dynamics. Others are left carrying the emotional weight alone, confusion, anger, grief, while the person who caused the harm moves on unaffected. This imbalance can feel deeply destabilizing as normal emotional exchanges rely on shared responsibility for impact. Over time, the absence of guilt allows increasingly severe behavior. Boundaries are crossed more easily. Consequences are minimized. Suffering becomes abstract. Without guilt to slow them down, dangerous individuals operate with emotional immunity, able to exploit, betray, or injure others without the internal signals that would stop most people from going further. Fear of exposure. Fear of exposure is the persistent anxiety of being seen clearly, where hidden motives, flaws, or behaviors risk coming into the light. In dangerous individuals, this fear becomes a driving force behind secrecy, control, and aggression. Exposure threatens the carefully constructed image they rely on to function, manipulate, or maintain power. If the truth emerges, the entire structure collapses. Emotionally, this fear creates constant tension beneath the surface. They are always monitoring conversations, reactions, and information flow, scanning for signs that someone is getting too close to the truth. Innocent questions feel invasive. Curiosity feels dangerous. Transparency feels like vulnerability they cannot afford. This hypervigilance often manifests as defensiveness, hostility, or sudden withdrawal. What makes fear of exposure especially volatile is how it motivates preemptive behavior. Rather than waiting to be discovered, these individuals may attack credibility, control narratives, or discredit others before suspicion fully forms. Lies multiply not to gain something new, but to protect what is already at risk. The goal becomes containment rather than connection. This fear also fuels manipulation. People who might expose them are managed through charm, intimidation, or emotional leverage. Trust is simulated, not shared. Intimacy is controlled and limited, because closeness increases the risk of being seen too clearly. When fear of exposure intensifies, empathy disappears. Anyone perceived as a threat becomes an enemy. Moral boundaries erode as self-preservation takes priority over integrity or harm. In this state, deception feels justified, cruelty feels necessary, and silencing others becomes a means of survival rather than a moral choice. Poor impulse control. Poor impulse control is the inability to pause, reflect, or regulate behavior before acting on urges, emotions, or desires. In dangerous individuals, this weakness removes the psychological buffer between feeling and action. Thoughts become commands. Emotions become justifications. The moment something is wanted, felt, or provoked, it demands expression without restraint. Emotionally, this creates volatility. The individual experiences urges intensely and urgently, with little tolerance for delay or frustration. Anger explodes instead of being processed. Desire overrides judgment. Consequences feel distant and abstract compared to the immediate relief of acting. This makes their behavior unpredictable and often alarming to those around them. What makes poor impulse control especially dangerous is how quickly it escalates harm. Words are spoken that cannot be taken back. Actions are taken that permanently alter relationships, safety, or trust. In the moment, the individual may feel justified, powerful, or relieved, but this relief is short-lived, giving way to denial, blame shifting, or indifference rather than accountability. Over time, repeated impulsive actions create chaos. Promises are broken, boundaries are violated. Stability becomes impossible because behavior changes based on mood rather than values. Others learn that reasoning, timing, or calm discussion offer little protection when impulses take over. This weakness also blocks growth. Reflection requires pause, and pause is exactly what is missing. Without the ability to slow down internal reactions, the individual remains trapped in cycles of reaction and damage, leaving others to absorb the emotional and practical fallout of behavior that was never truly considered. Callousness. Callousness is a deep emotional hardness that renders the suffering of others irrelevant or insignificant. In dangerous individuals, this weakness reflects an internal emotional numbness where compassion, concern, and emotional resonance fail to activate. Pain is observed, not felt. Distress is noticed, not shared. This creates a psychological distance that allows harm to occur without emotional interference. Emotionally, callous individuals often appear unaffected in situations that provoke strong reactions in others. They may witness fear, grief, or humiliation with calm detachment or mild annoyance. Emotional expressions from others feel burdensome rather than meaningful. This lack of response sends a chilling message. Your pain does not matter here. What makes callousness especially dangerous is how it silences internal restraint. Compassion normally acts as a brake, slowing behavior that could injure others. When that brake is absent, decisions become purely outcome-driven. If harm produces benefit, there is little reason not to proceed. This allows cruelty to feel neutral, even practical. Callousness also erodes relational safety. People around these individuals often feel unseen and emotionally abandoned, even in close proximity. Vulnerability is met with indifference or subtle contempt, teaching others to hide their emotions or accept neglect as normal. Over time, this emotional coldness escalates. What once seemed like insensitivity can evolve into outright disregard. Boundaries are crossed because emotional consequences carry no weight. In this state, suffering becomes background noise, and human connection loses its protective power, leaving space for repeated harm without emotional consequence. Cruel humor. Cruel humor is the use of jokes, sarcasm, or mockery to inflict emotional pain while disguising it as playfulness or wit. In dangerous individuals, this weakness allows hostility to be expressed without direct accountability. The harm is hidden behind laughter, giving them plausible deniability while still asserting dominance or superiority. Emotionally, cruel humor destabilizes people. It targets vulnerabilities, insecurities, or boundaries, often in public or high-pressure settings where responding feels risky. If the target reacts, they are framed as too sensitive or unable to take a joke. This reversal shifts blame away from the aggressor and deepens the emotional wound, teaching others to silence themselves. What makes cruel humor dangerous is how it normalizes disrespect. Repeated exposure erodes self-esteem and safety, especially when delivered by someone with power or influence. The laughter of others amplifies the harm, turning isolation into part of the experience. Over time, targets may begin to doubt their worth, believing the ridicule reflects truth rather than cruelty. Cruel humor also functions as a testing tool. It gauges how much emotional damage can be inflicted without consequence. If tolerated, the behavior escalates. If challenged, it often turns into defensiveness or outright aggression, revealing the hostility beneath the joke. This weakness thrives in environments where emotional harm is minimized. It allows dangerous individuals to release contempt while maintaining social cover. Beneath the surface, cruelty is the point. The joke is merely the delivery system, transforming humiliation into entertainment and pain into something others are pressured to accept with a smile. Overreaction to perceived slights. Overreaction to perceived slights is a psychological weakness where minor, ambiguous, or imagined offenses trigger intense emotional and behavioral responses. In dangerous individuals, this trait transforms everyday interactions into personal attacks. A delayed response, a neutral comment, a different opinion, or even silence can be interpreted as disrespect, rejection, or humiliation, regardless of intent. Emotionally, this overreaction is driven by insecurity and hypervigilance. The individual's sense of self is constantly scanning for threats, making them highly reactive to anything that could suggest loss of status or control. Their nervous system responds before logic has a chance to intervene. Anger, defensiveness, or contempt surge instantly, often surprising those around them who never intended harm. What makes this weakness destabilizing is its unpredictability. Because the trigger exists in perception rather than reality, others cannot reliably prevent it. People may replay conversations in their heads, trying to identify what went wrong, while the individual remains convinced that an obvious offense occurred. This gap between intention and reaction creates confusion, fear, and emotional exhaustion. Over time, this pattern conditions others to self-censor. Humor disappears, honesty fades. Authentic expression feels risky because even harmless behavior can provoke retaliation. The environment becomes tense, shaped by the constant need to avoid setting off an invisible tripwire. In dangerous individuals, overreaction to perceived slights often escalates into punishment. Grudges form quickly and linger. Retaliation feels justified, even righteous. The need to restore wounded pride outweighs empathy and proportion, turning minor misunderstandings into lasting conflicts and making emotional safety impossible for those caught in their orbit. Habitual intimidation. Habitual intimidation is the repeated use of fear, pressure, or implied threat to control others and shape their behavior. In dangerous individuals, intimidation becomes a language. It replaces communication, cooperation, and trust with tension and submission. The goal is not understanding, but compliance, achieved by making others feel uneasy, small, or unsafe. Emotionally, this weakness is rooted in insecurity masked as strength. The individual relies on fear to maintain control because they lack confidence in mutual respect or influence through trust. Raised voices, sharp looks, looming presence, aggressive silence, or unpredictable reactions are all tools used to keep others off balance. The fear itself becomes the leverage. What makes habitual intimidation especially damaging is its cumulative effect. Each incident may seem subtle or deniable, but over time, it reshapes the emotional environment. People begin to censor themselves, anticipate anger, and adjust behavior to avoid conflict. Autonomy slowly erodes as fear becomes a guiding force. Intimidation thrives on ambiguity. The threat is often implied rather than stated, allowing the individual to maintain plausible deniability while still exerting control. This makes victims question their own reactions, wondering if they are overreacting, even as their body remains in a constant state of tension. Over time, intimidation replaces dialogue entirely. Problems go unspoken. Boundaries collapse. Resistance feels dangerous. The intimidating individual learns that fear works faster than respect, reinforcing the behavior. This weakness turns relationships into power struggles and environments into pressure chambers, where safety depends not on trust, but on submission and silence. Manipulation through fear. Manipulation through fear is the deliberate use of intimidation, uncertainty, or threat to control another person's behavior, emotions, or decisions. In dangerous individuals, fear becomes a tool more reliable than persuasion or trust. When someone is afraid, they stop thinking clearly. They prioritize safety over truth, compliance over autonomy, and survival over resistance. Emotionally, this manipulation works by activating the nervous system. Subtle threats, unpredictable moods, silent punishments, or implied consequences keep others in a heightened state of alert. The fear does not always come from direct violence or shouting. Often it lives in tone shifts, looks, withdrawal of affection, or the sense that something bad will happen if expectations are not met. The ambiguity is intentional. Unclear danger keeps people anxious and obedient. What makes manipulation through fear especially effective is its invisibility. Outsiders may see nothing overtly abusive, while the person experiencing it feels constantly tense, careful, and restricted. They begin to anticipate reactions, adjust behavior, and suppress needs to avoid triggering fear. Over time, this creates self-policing, where control no longer needs to be enforced because it has been internalized. Fear also isolates. People under its influence doubt themselves, hesitate to speak up, and fear retaliation if they seek support. The manipulator benefits from this silence, framing themselves as powerful, unpredictable, or untouchable. This weakness corrodes autonomy from the inside. When fear governs behavior, consent becomes meaningless, and choice becomes illusionary. The individual using fear does not need to be present to maintain control. The threat lives on in the mind, shaping actions long after the moment has passed. Identity instability. Identity instability is the inability to maintain a consistent sense of self across time, situations, and relationships. In dangerous individuals, this weakness creates a shifting inner core where values, beliefs, and behavior change depending on what offers the most control or advantage in the moment. Who they are is not stable. It is reactive, adaptive, and often performative. Emotionally, this instability makes interactions feel disorienting. One day, they present as caring, confident, or principled. The next, those traits vanish without explanation. People are left trying to connect to a moving target, never fully sure which version of the person they are dealing with. This unpredictability creates unease because consistency is what allows trust to form. What makes identity instability dangerous is how easily it enables manipulation. Without a fixed internal identity, these individuals mirror others, adopt beliefs temporarily, or abandon values without internal conflict. They can convincingly play multiple roles, not out of curiosity or growth, but out of convenience. Authenticity becomes irrelevant when identity itself is a tool. This instability also fuels emotional volatility. When there is no stable self to anchor emotions, reactions are intense and poorly regulated. Criticism feels annihilating because there is no solid identity to absorb it. Praise feels intoxicating because it temporarily fills the void. Over time, identity instability erodes accountability. When confronted about past actions, they disconnect from them psychologically. "That's not who I am anymore" becomes an escape rather than growth. Relationships suffer because people cannot build trust with someone who continuously reinvents themselves to avoid responsibility. Beneath this weakness is emptiness. Without a coherent self, connection feels threatening and exposure feels dangerous. The instability protects them from feeling grounded, but it also ensures that chaos follows them wherever they go. Inflated sense of self-importance. An inflated sense of self-importance is the belief that one's thoughts, needs, and presence carry more weight than those of others. In dangerous individuals, this weakness reshapes reality so that everything revolves around them. Attention is expected, deference is assumed, and other people exist primarily as extensions, audiences, or obstacles rather than equals. Emotionally, this trait is sustained by constant comparison. The individual measures their value by being above others, not alongside them. When admiration is present, they feel validated and calm. When it is absent, they feel overlooked, insulted, or wronged. Neutral treatment is often experienced as disrespect because it fails to confirm their perceived superiority. What makes this weakness particularly corrosive is how it erodes empathy. When someone believes they matter more, the emotional experiences of others automatically matter less. Interrupting, dismissing, or exploiting people feels natural, even justified. Boundaries are seen as inconveniences, and reciprocity feels unnecessary. An inflated sense of self-importance also distorts accountability. Mistakes are minimized while others' errors are magnified. Credit is claimed easily while blame is outsourced. Over time, the individual constructs a narrative where they are always central, always right, and always deserving of special treatment. In relationships, this creates imbalance. Others are expected to accommodate, admire, and adapt. When they don't, resentment surfaces quickly. The individual may respond with contempt, withdrawal, or punishment to reassert their perceived status. The need to feel important overrides fairness, mutual respect, and emotional connection, leaving those around them feeling diminished, unseen, and expendable. Chronic envy. Chronic envy is a persistent, corrosive comparison in which another person's success, happiness, or recognition is experienced as a personal injury. In dangerous individuals, envy is not occasional or situational. It is a constant undercurrent shaping perception and motivation. Instead of inspiration, others' achievements trigger resentment and quiet hostility. Emotionally, chronic envy creates a sense of deprivation. The individual feels perpetually behind, overlooked, or unfairly denied, even when evidence suggests otherwise. This inner narrative fuels bitterness, making it difficult for them to feel genuine joy for anyone else. Praise directed at others feels like theft, as if something rightfully theirs has been taken away. What makes this weakness dangerous is how it distorts intent. Success in others is reinterpreted as arrogance. Happiness is seen as undeserved. The envied person becomes a symbol of everything the individual believes they lack. This can lead to subtle sabotage, dismissive comments, or passive-aggressive behavior designed to diminish what they cannot attain. Over time, envy hardens into entitlement and justification. If they believe others have more than they deserve, harming them feels less wrong. Undermining them feels fair. Empathy erodes as comparison dominates emotional life. Chronic envy also poisons relationships. Trust dissolves when admiration is replaced by rivalry. Support turns conditional. The individual may seek closeness not to connect, but to monitor, compete, or gather ammunition for future resentment. Left unchecked, envy becomes a quiet engine of hostility, driving behavior that aims not to grow the self, but to pull others down to ease the pain of comparison. Emotional detachment. Emotional detachment is the psychological distancing from feelings, both one's own and those of others, resulting in shallow or absent emotional engagement. In dangerous individuals, this weakness creates an internal disconnect where emotions are observed intellectually rather than experienced. Feelings are analyzed, categorized, or ignored, but rarely felt deeply enough to influence behavior. Emotionally detached individuals often appear calm, composed, and unaffected, even in situations charged with pain, intimacy, or conflict. This calm can be misleading. Beneath it lies an inability to emotionally bond, to resonate with another person's inner world, or to experience the mutual vulnerability that creates genuine connection. Relationships feel one-sided, hollow, or transactional because emotional presence is missing. What makes emotional detachment dangerous is its capacity to normalize harm. When emotional impact is not registered, actions lose their human weight. Hurt becomes abstract. Consequences become distant concepts rather than felt experiences. This allows the individual to make cold decisions that disregard emotional fallout because they do not internally absorb it. Detachment also creates power imbalances. Others may invest emotionally, seeking closeness or validation, while the detached individual remains unaffected and in control. This asymmetry can be used to manipulate, with affection given or withdrawn strategically rather than organically. Over time, people around emotionally detached individuals begin to feel invisible and unimportant. Their feelings seem to vanish into a void. The absence of emotional feedback creates confusion, longing, and self-doubt. In this environment, connection withers, and emotional neglect becomes a quiet but powerful form of harm. Exploitative relationships. Exploitative relationships are connections formed not for mutual care, respect, or growth, but for extraction. In dangerous individuals, relationships are evaluated based on usefulness rather than emotional depth. People are valued for what they provide: attention, resources, status, labor, loyalty, rather than who they are. When usefulness fades, so does the bond. Emotionally, these relationships feel unbalanced from the start. One person gives, adapts, and compromises, while the other takes, directs, and benefits. Support flows in one direction. Needs are acknowledged only when they align with the exploiter's goals. Over time, the exploited individual feels drained, unseen, and replaceable, even if they cannot immediately name why. What makes exploitative relationships dangerous is how subtly they develop. Early warmth, charm, or intensity creates attachment before the imbalance becomes clear. Once invested, the exploited person is more likely to rationalize mistreatment, believing they must earn care or prove worth. Guilt and obligation are quietly woven into the dynamic. Exploitative individuals often justify their behavior internally. They see others as resources in a competitive world, not as equals deserving reciprocity. This mindset allows them to demand loyalty without offering it, to take without giving, and to exit without remorse when the exchange no longer benefits them. Over time, these relationships leave lasting emotional damage. Trust erodes. Self-worth diminishes. The realization that connection was conditional can feel deeply destabilizing. For the exploiter, the pattern reinforces emotional detachment, ensuring that relationships remain transactional rather than human, and that harm feels necessary rather than cruel. Lack of genuine attachment. Lack of genuine attachment is the inability to form deep, emotionally rooted bonds where care, loyalty, and concern exist beyond self-interest. In dangerous individuals, relationships are not experienced as connections but as utilities. People are valued for what they provide: attention, validation, resources, control, not for who they are. When usefulness fades, emotional connection dissolves with it. Emotionally, this weakness creates a hollow form of closeness. Affection may be expressed, but it lacks emotional weight. Promises feel flexible. Separation carries little grief. The individual can appear intensely involved one moment and emotionally detached the next, leaving others confused by the sudden absence of warmth or concern. This inconsistency is not conflict-driven. It reflects an absence of true emotional bonding. What makes this trait especially dangerous is how it enables exploitation. Without genuine attachment, there is no internal barrier against using, discarding, or betraying others. Harm does not register as loss, only as inconvenience. Loyalty feels unnecessary because emotional investment was never fully present. People on the receiving end often sense something is wrong long before they can name it. Support feels conditional. Care feels performative. Intimacy never deepens into safety. Over time, they may work harder to earn connection that never truly forms, draining themselves emotionally. Lack of genuine attachment also allows for rapid emotional replacement. Relationships end without processing or accountability, and new ones begin without reflection. This emotional disposability creates a pattern where people are cycled through, leaving behind confusion and damage, while the individual remains unaffected, unburdened by loss, and free to repeat the same hollow connections again. Aggressive competitiveness. Aggressive competitiveness is the compulsive need to win, outperform, or dominate others, even when no real competition exists. In dangerous individuals, life becomes a constant scoreboard where worth is measured by superiority. Cooperation feels like weakness, and shared success feels meaningless unless someone else is clearly beneath them. Emotionally, this weakness is fueled by insecurity masked as ambition. The individual experiences others' success as a threat rather than a neutral or positive event. Comparison is constant and exhausting. Every interaction carries the pressure to prove something, to assert dominance, or to avoid appearing inferior. Losing, or even appearing equal, triggers anger, shame, or hostility. What makes aggressive competitiveness especially destructive is how it corrodes relationships. Support is conditional. Kindness is strategic. People are treated as rivals rather than collaborators, turning workplaces, friendships, and families into battlegrounds. Trust collapses because vulnerability can be used as ammunition, and cooperation risks being exploited. Aggressive competitors often escalate conflicts unnecessarily. Small disagreements become contests. Feedback becomes an attack. Compromise feels like surrender. This rigidity creates tension and invites retaliation, reinforcing their belief that the world is hostile and must be conquered rather than navigated. Over time, this mindset isolates the individual. Constant competition leaves little room for connection, empathy, or mutual growth. The need to win overrides the ability to bond. Even victories feel hollow because they require someone else's loss to feel meaningful. This weakness traps the individual in perpetual conflict, where identity depends on dominance and peace feels indistinguishable from defeat. Hostility toward authority. Hostility toward authority is a persistent, emotionally charged resistance to rules, limits, and figures perceived as having power or control. In dangerous individuals, this weakness is not about healthy skepticism or independence. It is a reflexive opposition rooted in insecurity and threatened identity. Authority represents restraint, and restraint feels intolerable. Emotionally, this hostility is fueled by sensitivity to perceived domination. Being told what to do, corrected, or held accountable triggers anger rather than reflection. Authority figures are seen not as guides or structures, but as adversaries. Even neutral boundaries are interpreted as personal attacks, leading to defiance that feels emotionally justified rather than reckless. What makes this weakness dangerous is how it destabilizes judgment. Rules are not evaluated based on fairness or logic, but on whether they limit the individual's freedom or ego. The automatic urge to resist overrides reason. This can lead to reckless decisions, escalation of conflict, and deliberate rule-breaking simply to assert autonomy. Hostility toward authority often masks deeper issues with control. The individual fears being subordinate, exposed, or constrained, so they reject hierarchy altogether. This rejection can evolve into chronic conflict with institutions, workplaces, law enforcement, or any structure that imposes limits. Over time, this mindset isolates the individual. Cooperation feels like surrender. Compromise feels like defeat. Relationships with equals also suffer because any attempt at shared structure or mutual accountability can trigger the same hostile response. In this state, opposition becomes identity. Resistance replaces responsibility, and conflict becomes a source of emotional stimulation, pushing the individual into increasingly unstable and confrontational patterns of behavior. Disregard for consequences. Disregard for consequences is the inability or unwillingness to emotionally register the outcomes of one's actions, especially when those outcomes cause harm. In dangerous individuals, this weakness creates a tunnel vision where immediate desire, impulse, or control matters more than future impact. Consequences exist intellectually, but they do not carry emotional weight. Emotionally, this trait makes behavior feel reckless and unsettling. Decisions are made in the moment, driven by urges rather than foresight. When harm occurs, it is treated as an abstract side effect rather than a meaningful result. The emotional distance from outcomes allows the individual to move forward without hesitation, even as damage accumulates around them. What makes disregard for consequences dangerous is how it accelerates escalation. Without fear, guilt, or concern to slow behavior down, boundaries are crossed repeatedly. Each act reinforces the belief that nothing truly bad will happen, or that any fallout can be managed later through denial, manipulation, or blame shifting. People around them often carry the burden of foresight instead. They anticipate problems, clean up damage, and absorb emotional or practical fallout. This imbalance enables the behavior to continue, as the individual never fully experiences the cost of their actions. Disregard for consequences also weakens accountability. When confronted, the focus shifts to intent rather than impact. "I didn't mean to" replaces responsibility for what occurred. Over time, this mindset erodes trust and safety, creating a pattern where harm is predictable, repair is minimal, and learning never occurs because the future never feels real enough to matter. Moral disengagement. Moral disengagement is the psychological process of disconnecting actions from ethical standards so harmful behavior no longer feels wrong. In dangerous individuals, this weakness allows them to act in ways that violate basic human values without experiencing guilt, shame, or internal conflict. Morality becomes flexible, conditional, and easily rewritten to suit personal goals. Emotionally, moral disengagement functions as a numbing mechanism. The individual reframes harm as necessity, responsibility as inconvenience, and cruelty as justification. Language is altered to soften reality. Exploitation becomes doing what's required. Manipulation becomes being strategic. Violence, whether emotional or physical, is reframed as deserved. By changing the meaning of their actions, they protect themselves from emotional consequences. What makes this weakness especially alarming is how it escalates behavior. Once moral discomfort is removed, there is no internal break. Each harmful act becomes easier than the last. Lines that once felt unthinkable slowly disappear, replaced by rationalizations that grow more extreme over time. The absence of guilt is not accidental, it is actively maintained. Moral disengagement also involves dehumanization. Others are reduced to labels, roles, or obstacles rather than full human beings. Their pain becomes abstract. Their suffering feels irrelevant. This emotional distancing allows harm to be inflicted without empathy interfering. When challenged, individuals relying on moral disengagement often respond with justification rather than reflection. They cite rules, logic, ideology, or necessity to defend their actions. Accountability feels unfair because, in their internal narrative, they did nothing wrong. This psychological separation between action and conscience creates a dangerous state where harm feels reasonable, repeatable, and emotionally invisible. Victim mentality. Victim mentality is a deeply ingrained psychological stance where an individual consistently perceives themselves as wronged, oppressed, or unfairly treated, regardless of context or evidence. In dangerous individuals, this weakness becomes an identity rather than a reaction. Suffering is not something that happened to them. It is who they are. The world is experienced as hostile, unjust, and personally antagonistic. Emotionally, victim mentality offers comfort through absolution. If they are always the victim, they are never responsible. Mistakes become injustices. Consequences become persecution. This mindset shields them from guilt and self-reflection while allowing resentment to grow unchecked. Anger feels justified because, in their narrative, they are merely responding to constant mistreatment. What makes this weakness especially manipulative is how it weaponizes sympathy. The individual may exaggerate harm, reinterpret neutral events as attacks, or selectively recall memories that reinforce their sense of victimhood. Others are pressured to comfort, defend, or excuse them, even as boundaries are crossed or harm is inflicted. Accountability is reframed as cruelty. Over time, victim mentality distorts perception. Offers of help feel patronizing, feedback feels abusive, responsibility feels like betrayal. The individual becomes emotionally rigid, clinging to grievance because it provides moral superiority and emotional leverage. This weakness also fuels retaliation. If they believe they are always wronged, harming others feels like self-defense. Cruelty becomes justified as retribution. The victim identity hardens into entitlement to anger, manipulation, or dominance, creating a cycle where perceived suffering authorizes real harm without ever challenging the story that keeps it alive. Obsession with revenge. Obsession with revenge is the fixation on retaliating against perceived wrongs, where emotional energy becomes consumed by the desire to make others suffer in return. In dangerous individuals, this weakness transforms pain into purpose. Hurt is not processed or released, it is preserved, nurtured, and sharpened into a motivating force that drives thoughts, decisions, and behavior. Emotionally, revenge offers a false sense of relief and control. When someone feels humiliated, betrayed, or diminished, revenge promises restoration of power. The idea of making the other person pay becomes emotionally intoxicating. Anger is replayed repeatedly, reinforcing itself until it feels justified, even necessary. Letting go feels like losing, and forgiveness feels like surrender. What makes this obsession dangerous is how it distorts reality. The original event becomes exaggerated and simplified into a moral narrative where the individual is righteous and the other is deserving of harm. Empathy collapses under this framing. Any action taken in pursuit of revenge feels acceptable, regardless of collateral damage or escalation. Revenge-focused individuals often sacrifice long-term well-being for short-term emotional satisfaction. Relationships, opportunities, and safety are willingly jeopardized to achieve emotional payoff. The mind becomes future-oriented toward retaliation rather than growth or healing, trapping the individual in the moment of injury. This fixation also prevents emotional resolution. Instead of processing pain, the individual externalizes it, tying their emotional relief to someone else's suffering. The wound never closes because it is continually reopened. In this state, revenge is mistaken for justice, and harm becomes a means of emotional regulation rather than a warning sign to stop. Inability to feel genuine love. The inability to feel genuine love is the absence of deep emotional attachment, care, and concern for another person's well-being beyond self-interest. In dangerous individuals, love is often confused with possession, attachment, or dependency. What looks like affection on the surface is driven by need, control, or validation rather than true emotional connection. Emotionally, this creates relationships that feel intense but hollow. Attention may be overwhelming at first, creating the illusion of closeness, but it lacks depth and stability. Care is conditional. Affection appears strongest when the other person is compliant, admiring, or useful, and fades when independence or boundaries emerge. This conditionality leaves others feeling confused, constantly trying to earn something that never fully arrives. What makes this weakness dangerous is how easily love becomes a performance. Words of devotion, promises, and gestures are used strategically to secure loyalty or access. When genuine love is absent, another person's pain does not register as meaningful. Hurt is minimized, ignored, or reframed as weakness. Emotional bonds become leverage rather than responsibility. Without genuine love, attachment is often rooted in fear of loss, abandonment, or loss of control. Jealousy replaces care. Possessiveness replaces protection. The relationship exists to regulate the individual's emotions, not to nurture mutual growth. Over time, those involved begin to feel emotionally starved. They may blame themselves for not being enough, unaware that the emptiness is structural, not personal. The inability to feel genuine love ensures that intimacy never deepens, only tightens, turning connection into captivity rather than shared emotional safety. Emotional shallowness. Emotional shallowness is the limited capacity to experience feelings with depth, complexity, or lasting emotional impact. In dangerous individuals, emotions exist briefly and superficially, rising and disappearing without leaving meaningful internal traces. Joy is fleeting, sadness is short-lived, and remorse evaporates quickly. What remains is an emotional flatness that gives the illusion of calm while masking an absence of genuine emotional engagement. Emotionally, this weakness creates a disconnect between experience and meaning. Events that would deeply affect most people barely register. Loss does not transform. Harm does not linger. Emotional reactions may appear appropriate in the moment, but they lack weight and continuity. Once the situation ends, the emotion ends with it, as if nothing significant occurred. What makes emotional shallowness dangerous is how it undermines conscience. Deep emotions are what anchor empathy, attachment, and responsibility. Without them, there is little internal resistance to repeating harmful behavior. Pain caused to others may be acknowledged intellectually, but it does not resonate emotionally enough to alter future choices. This trait also enables convincing emotional performance. Because emotions are not deeply felt, they can be easily imitated. Apologies, affection, and concern may sound sincere, yet feel strangely empty to those receiving them. Over time, people sense the absence of emotional depth, but struggle to articulate why interactions feel unsatisfying or unsettling. In relationships, emotional shallowness prevents true intimacy. Bonds do not deepen, conflicts are not emotionally processed, and trust remains fragile. Others may feel unseen or emotionally starved, carrying the emotional weight alone. The individual moves forward unaffected, free from emotional residue, able to detach easily and repeat patterns without the emotional friction that would force most people to pause, reflect, or change. Power fixation. Power fixation is the obsessive focus on acquiring, maintaining, and displaying power as the primary source of safety and self-worth. In dangerous individuals, power is not a tool, it is an identity. Without it, they feel exposed, insignificant, or threatened. With it, they feel real. Every interaction is subconsciously evaluated through the lens of who has control and who does not. Emotionally, this fixation is driven by fear rather than confidence. The individual equates vulnerability with weakness and believes that being dominated is the worst possible outcome. As a result, they are constantly scanning for shifts in hierarchy, signs of resistance, or challenges to their authority. Even neutral behavior from others can feel like a threat if it suggests independence or equality. What makes power fixation especially dangerous is how it overrides empathy and reason. Decisions are not guided by what is right or fair, but by what increases control. Relationships become strategic. Kindness becomes conditional. Trust is treated as a liability because it requires shared power rather than unilateral dominance. Over time, this obsession distorts reality. Cooperation feels suspicious. Mutual respect feels unstable. The individual may create conflict simply to reassert dominance, because peace does not provide the same reassurance as control. When power is questioned or reduced, panic can turn into aggression, coercion, or punishment. Power fixation traps the individual in a narrow emotional range where safety only exists at the top. Any loss of influence feels catastrophic, pushing them to cling harder, dominate more aggressively, and sacrifice connection for control, even as isolation and hostility grow around them. Unstable self-image. Unstable self-image is the absence of a consistent, grounded sense of identity, causing a person's self-perception to shift rapidly based on mood, environment, or external feedback. In dangerous individuals, this weakness creates an inner void where identity should be. Without a stable internal anchor, they rely on others to define who they are, oscillating between inflated confidence and deep insecurity. Emotionally, this instability is exhausting and volatile. Praise can trigger grandiosity, while criticism can feel annihilating. A single comment, rejection, or comparison can radically alter how they see themselves in the moment. Because their sense of self is fragile, they react intensely to anything that threatens it, often with anger, defensiveness, or withdrawal. What makes an unstable self-image dangerous is how it fuels erratic behavior. When identity shifts, values shift with it. Promises, morals, and loyalties change depending on which version of the self is dominant at the time. This unpredictability makes it difficult for others to feel safe because the person they are dealing with today may not exist tomorrow. To stabilize themselves, these individuals often seek external control. They may dominate, manipulate, or demand validation to reinforce a preferred self-image. Others become mirrors rather than equals, expected to constantly reflect approval and reassurance. When that validation is withheld, the instability intensifies. Shame, rage, or emptiness surge, and destructive behavior may follow as an attempt to reassert identity. Without a stable sense of self, emotions run unchecked, boundaries blur, and relationships become tools for self-definition rather than genuine connection. Dehumanization of others. Dehumanization of others is the psychological process of stripping people of their individuality, emotions, and intrinsic worth, reducing them to objects, roles, or obstacles. In dangerous individuals, this weakness allows harm to occur without emotional resistance. When someone is no longer fully perceived as human, their pain loses significance and their boundaries lose meaning. Emotionally, dehumanization creates a chilling distance. Others are spoken about in terms of usefulness, weakness, stupidity, or threat rather than as complex individuals. Language becomes dismissive or degrading, even casually so. This mindset numbs emotional response, making cruelty feel efficient rather than disturbing. Compassion fades because it requires recognizing shared humanity. What makes dehumanization dangerous is how it justifies behavior that would otherwise feel unacceptable. Exploitation becomes practical, aggression becomes necessary, dismissal becomes deserved. By reframing others as lesser, the individual removes the internal moral conflict that normally restrains harmful actions. This weakness often develops alongside power, resentment, or entitlement. When people are viewed as inferior, replaceable, or undeserving, empathy feels unnecessary. Emotional detachment becomes a shield protecting the individual from guilt, doubt, or vulnerability. For those subjected to dehumanization, the impact is profound. Being treated as less than human erodes self-worth and safety, creating emotional harm that lingers long after the interaction ends. For the one dehumanizing others, the world becomes increasingly hostile and divided. Connection disappears, replaced by control and contempt, ensuring that relationships are governed by dominance rather than mutual recognition. Compulsive dominance displays. Compulsive dominance displays are the repetitive, often unnecessary demonstrations of power meant to assert superiority and control even when no threat exists. In dangerous individuals, dominance is not a response to challenge, but a constant need to be reinforced. Silence feels risky. Equality feels destabilizing. If power is not visibly asserted, they feel diminished. Emotionally, this weakness is rooted in insecurity masked as strength. The individual relies on external signals, fear, submission, compliance, to regulate their internal state. Without visible dominance, anxiety rises. They may interrupt, talk over others, issue commands, belittle opinions, or escalate conflicts simply to reassert hierarchy. The display itself is the relief. What makes this trait especially unsettling is its compulsive nature. Dominance is asserted even in inappropriate or trivial situations. A casual conversation becomes a contest. Cooperation becomes submission. These displays are not strategic. They are reflexive, driven by an internal pressure to prove superiority again and again. Over time, people around them learn that peace depends on deference. Authenticity fades as others adapt to avoid provoking power plays. This creates an environment where fear replaces respect and silence replaces honesty. The dominant individual may interpret this compliance as confirmation of their authority, reinforcing the cycle. Compulsive dominance displays also escalate when challenged. Resistance, independence, or confidence in others triggers stronger assertions of power. Empathy disappears as the need to win takes precedence. In this state, humiliation, intimidation, or emotional aggression feel justified. Dominance becomes an identity, not a behavior, and maintaining it becomes more important than connection, fairness, or emotional safety. Excessive suspicion. Excessive suspicion is a persistent distrust of others' intentions, where motives are questioned before actions are understood. In dangerous individuals, this weakness turns human interaction into a minefield. Trust is not withheld cautiously, it is rejected entirely. Every gesture is analyzed, every word dissected, every pause interpreted as evidence of hidden agendas. Emotionally, excessive suspicion keeps the individual locked in a state of internal vigilance. Their mind rarely rests. They feel surrounded by potential betrayal, convinced that others are waiting for the right moment to deceive, undermine, or exploit them. This constant alertness creates anxiety that quickly hardens into defensiveness and hostility. Suspicion becomes a form of self-protection even when no threat exists. What makes this weakness especially destabilizing is how it distorts reality. Neutral behaviors are reframed as suspicious. Kindness is interpreted as manipulation. Boundaries are seen as secrecy. The individual stops responding to what is actually happening and instead reacts to imagined threats, often accusing others of intentions they never had. Over time, excessive suspicion erodes relationships. Reassurance never lasts because the fear does not come from evidence but from an internal narrative of danger. People around them feel interrogated, mistrusted, and emotionally unsafe, eventually withdrawing or becoming guarded themselves. That withdrawal is then used as confirmation that suspicion was justified. As suspicion intensifies, empathy collapses. Other perspectives are dismissed as lies. Accountability feels threatening because it implies the problem might be internal. This weakness creates a self-contained world where mistrust feeds isolation, isolation feeds fear, and fear justifies control, accusation, and preemptive emotional or psychological aggression. Inflexibility in thinking. Inflexibility in thinking is the rigid attachment to one perspective, belief, or interpretation, combined with an inability or refusal to adapt when presented with new information. In dangerous individuals, this weakness locks the mind into narrow pathways where alternative viewpoints feel threatening rather than informative. Change is not experienced as growth, but as loss of control. Emotionally, rigid thinkers experience disagreement as personal invalidation. A differing opinion is not just another perspective. It feels like an attack on identity. This triggers defensiveness, irritation, or hostility because their sense of stability depends on certainty. Flexibility requires tolerating ambiguity, and ambiguity creates discomfort they cannot manage. What makes this weakness dangerous is how it shuts down learning. When beliefs cannot be questioned, mistakes cannot be corrected. Harmful behavior is justified rather than examined. Evidence that contradicts their worldview is dismissed, mocked, or reinterpreted to preserve their internal narrative. Reality is forced to conform to belief, not the other way around. Inflexibility also damages relationships. Conversations become repetitive and exhausting, circling the same arguments without resolution. Compromise feels impossible because yielding even slightly feels like defeat. Over time, others stop trying to communicate honestly, knowing their words will not be received. This rigidity often hides deep insecurity. By clinging to fixed ideas, the individual protects themselves from the fear of being wrong, uncertain, or exposed. However, this protection comes at a cost. As the world changes and people evolve, the rigid mind fractures under pressure, responding with control, anger, or withdrawal. Inflexibility turns growth into threat and difference into danger, creating conflict where understanding could have existed. Poor stress tolerance. Poor stress tolerance is the inability to endure pressure, uncertainty, or emotional strain without psychological breakdown or harmful reaction. In dangerous individuals, stress is not processed internally. It overwhelms the system and demands immediate discharge. Even moderate pressure can feel unbearable, triggering panic, rage, withdrawal, or impulsive behavior that seems disproportionate to the situation. Emotionally, this weakness creates fragility beneath the surface. These individuals often appear functional only when conditions are controlled and predictable. When demands increase or situations become complex, their coping mechanisms collapse. Stress is experienced as threat rather than challenge, activating survival responses instead of problem solving. The body reacts before the mind can stabilize. What makes poor stress tolerance dangerous is how it destabilizes environments. Under pressure, judgment deteriorates, decisions become reactive, accountability disappears. Others are blamed for the stress rather than the situation itself, shifting responsibility outward. This can lead to emotional outbursts, cruelty, or reckless actions that cause lasting damage. People around them quickly learn to absorb stress on their behalf. They manage crises, soften demands, and suppress their own needs to prevent escalation. Over time, this dynamic reinforces the weakness. The individual never builds resilience because others continually buffer reality for them. Poor stress tolerance also fuels control and aggression. When overwhelmed, regaining dominance becomes a way to restore internal calm. Pressure is relieved by forcing the world to bend rather than adapting to it. This creates a cycle where stress intolerance leads to harmful behavior, and harmful behavior creates more instability, ensuring that stress remains constant and destructive. Absence of compassion. Absence of compassion is the inability to feel concern for suffering or distress in others, even when that suffering is visible, verbalized, or severe. In dangerous individuals, this weakness creates a psychological distance from human pain. Others' struggles are not emotionally registered as meaningful experiences, but as background noise, inconveniences, or opportunities. Emotionally, compassion is what slows people down. It creates hesitation, care, and moral friction. Without it, there is nothing internally urging restraint. A person may recognize that someone is hurting, yet feel no pull to respond, soften, or help. The suffering is acknowledged intellectually, but it does not stir anything inside. This emotional emptiness allows cruelty to coexist with calm. What makes the absence of compassion especially disturbing is how easily harm becomes normalized. Discomfort in others does not trigger concern, only irritation or indifference. Requests for understanding feel burdensome. Vulnerability is often met with coldness, dismissal, or contempt. Over time, this teaches others that pain will not be met with care, only silence or judgment. This trait also fuels exploitation. When compassion is absent, people are evaluated by usefulness rather than humanity. Their pain does not factor into decisions unless it creates consequences for the individual causing it. Emotional boundaries are crossed without hesitation because the internal signal to stop never activates. In relationships, absence of compassion creates emotional starvation. Support feels transactional or non-existent. Suffering is faced alone, even in close proximity. The individual remains unaffected, untroubled by the emotional fallout they cause. Without compassion, harm feels clean and uncomplicated, making it easy to repeat, escalate, and justify without ever feeling the weight of another person's pain. Manipulative victimhood. Manipulative victimhood is the deliberate use of perceived suffering to control, disarm, or dominate others. In dangerous individuals, pain is not something to heal from, but something to wield. They learn that appearing wounded grants protection, sympathy, and moral immunity, allowing them to influence situations without appearing aggressive. Harm is reframed as hurt. Control is disguised as vulnerability. Emotionally, this weakness thrives on reversal. When confronted with their behavior, they collapse into distress, redirecting attention away from accountability and toward their feelings. Tears, exhaustion, trauma narratives, or exaggerated fragility become tools that silence criticism. Others hesitate to speak honestly, fearing they will cause further harm, while the manipulator quietly regains control. What makes manipulative victimhood especially insidious is its plausibility. The emotions displayed often feel real, even if the intent behind them is strategic. This blurs the line between genuine pain and calculated performance, leaving others confused and emotionally trapped. Sympathy becomes a leash. Compassion becomes leverage. Over time, relationships become unbalanced. The manipulative individual is always the one who needs understanding, patience, and exceptions. Boundaries are framed as cruelty. Consequences are framed as abuse. Anyone who resists is cast as heartless, aggressive, or oppressive, reinforcing the manipulator's narrative. This weakness allows aggression to hide behind fragility. By occupying the role of the victim, the individual avoids scrutiny while exerting quiet dominance. Responsibility is deflected, power is retained, and harm continues under the cover of suffering. The emotional cost is paid by those who are made to carry guilt for damage they did not cause. Habitual rulebreaking. Habitual rulebreaking is the persistent disregard for rules, norms, and boundaries, driven not by necessity, but by impulse, entitlement, or defiance. In dangerous individuals, this weakness reflects a deep resistance to external limits. Rules are experienced as challenges to overcome rather than structures meant to protect or organize. Obedience feels humiliating, and compliance feels like weakness. Emotionally, habitual rule breakers derive stimulation from transgression. Crossing lines produces a sense of power and autonomy, a quiet thrill that reinforces the behavior. Each violation confirms an internal belief that they are untouchable or smarter than the system. When consequences are avoided, the behavior escalates, strengthening the illusion that rules apply only to others. What makes this weakness dangerous is how it erodes accountability. Rules exist to prevent harm, but when they are ignored, restraint disappears. Boundaries become suggestions rather than limits. This creates unpredictability because behavior is guided by desire rather than responsibility. Others are forced to remain vigilant, unsure which lines will be crossed next. Habitual rule-breaking also normalizes disrespect. Social contracts lose meaning, promises feel optional, trust erodes as consistency vanishes. When confronted, these individuals often rationalize their behavior. framing rules as unfair, stupid, or restrictive rather than acknowledging their own disregard. Over time, this pattern isolates them from stable systems and relationships. Conflict with authority increases. Consequences eventually catch up, but by then, the individual may feel persecuted rather than accountable. In this state, defiance becomes identity and chaos becomes familiar, reinforcing a cycle where breaking rules feels safer than respecting them. Predatory charm. Predatory charm is the calculated use of charisma, warmth, and likability to lower defenses and gain access to people for personal advantage. In dangerous individuals, charm is not an expression of genuine connection but a strategy. It is deployed selectively, intensified quickly, and withdrawn once trust has been secured or usefulness has been extracted. Emotionally, predatory charm feels intoxicating at first. The attention is focused, flattering, and disarming. You feel seen, chosen, and understood in a way that feels rare. This emotional pull accelerates trust before safety has been established. The speed itself is a warning sign, but the emotional high makes it easy to ignore. What makes this weakness dangerous is its precision. Predatory charm adapts to the target. Values are mirrored. Interests are shared. Emotional language is tailored to fit exactly what the other person wants or needs to hear. This creates a false sense of alignment that feels deeply personal, even though it is carefully constructed. Once attachment forms, the charm shifts. Warmth becomes inconsistent. Affection becomes conditional. Confusion replaces clarity. The same charm that opened the door now keeps the person emotionally invested, chasing the version of connection that appeared at the beginning. Predatory charm also provides cover. When harm occurs, others struggle to reconcile it with the charming persona. Victims doubt themselves because someone so charismatic couldn't mean harm. This social protection allows manipulation and exploitation to continue unnoticed or unchallenged. At its core, predatory charm is about access without accountability. It bypasses boundaries by making people feel special rather than safe. The danger lies not in the charm itself, but in what it conceals: intent that is self-serving, emotionally detached, and willing to discard connection once its purpose has been fulfilled. Emotional volatility. Emotional volatility is the rapid and intense shifting of emotional states where reactions are unpredictable, exaggerated, and difficult to regulate. In dangerous individuals, this weakness turns emotion into a weapon rather than a signal. Calm can flip into rage without warning. Affection can dissolve into hostility in seconds. The emotional environment around them feels unstable, charged, and unsafe. Emotionally, volatility is driven by poor regulation and internal chaos. Feelings surge faster than thought, overwhelming any capacity for reflection. Frustration escalates into anger. Disappointment turns into contempt. The individual experiences emotions as events that happen to them, not states they can manage. This creates a sense of being out of control, which is often externalized onto others. What makes emotional volatility especially damaging is its conditioning effect. People around volatile individuals become hyper-alert, constantly scanning for mood shifts. They adjust behavior, tone, and honesty to avoid triggering the next outburst. Over time, this erodes authenticity and creates chronic stress, as emotional safety becomes dependent on guessing the volatile person's internal state. Volatility also distorts accountability. Harmful reactions are excused as being overwhelmed or pushed too far, shifting responsibility onto others. The intensity of emotion is used to justify behavior, making boundaries difficult to enforce. Those affected are often left managing the aftermath of reactions they did not cause. In dangerous individuals, emotional volatility can escalate into intimidation or control. Outbursts become tools that silence disagreement and enforce compliance. The unpredictability itself becomes power. When emotions swing violently and without warning, others learn that stability comes only through submission, reinforcing a cycle where emotional chaos dominates relationships and keeps everyone else emotionally off balance. Cold calculation. Cold calculation is the ability to detach emotion from decision-making to such a degree that people, consequences, and suffering are reduced to variables in a mental equation. In dangerous individuals, this weakness creates a chilling form of clarity where empathy is deliberately shut down in favor of efficiency, advantage, and outcome. Feelings are not ignored accidentally. They are intentionally excluded. Emotionally, cold calculation creates distance. The individual observes rather than connects, analyzes rather than feels. Situations involving conflict, harm, or manipulation are approached with a steady calm that can feel unsettling to others. While most people experience hesitation or inner conflict when causing pain, the coldly calculating individual experiences focus. The absence of emotional interference feels like strength. What makes this trait especially dangerous is its precision. Actions are planned, timed, and executed with intention. Words are chosen for effect. Reactions are anticipated. People's weaknesses, fears, and attachments are studied and stored, not to protect them, but to exploit them later if needed. Harm is not impulsive, it is efficient. Over time, this mindset erodes moral restraint. When decisions are judged solely by effectiveness, ethical considerations become optional. If an action works, it is justified. If someone is hurt, that is viewed as collateral rather than consequence. Emotional damage is minimized because it does not register internally. Cold calculation also creates a false sense of superiority. The individual believes their emotional detachment makes them smarter, more evolved, or more realistic than others. In reality, it isolates them from human connection, turning relationships into chessboards and people into pieces, all while maintaining a calm exterior that hides how dangerous intentional indifference can be. Exploiting trust. Exploiting trust is the deliberate use of another person's openness, loyalty, or belief in good faith as a means to gain advantage. In dangerous individuals, this weakness turns intimacy into access and honesty into opportunity. Trust is not honored as something fragile and earned. It is viewed as a resource to be extracted and used. Emotionally, this exploitation begins with patience and observation. The individual presents themselves as reliable, understanding, or supportive, encouraging vulnerability and dependence. As trust deepens, personal information, emotional attachments, and unguarded moments are quietly collected. What feels like connection to one person becomes leverage to the other. What makes exploiting trust especially damaging is the betrayal embedded in it. The victim's willingness to believe, to open up, and to rely is later used against them. Secrets become tools. Weaknesses become pressure points. Loyalty becomes a trap. This reversal creates deep emotional injury because it attacks the very instinct that allows humans to bond safely. Those who exploit trust often justify their behavior internally. They frame manipulation as cleverness, necessity, or entitlement, distancing themselves from the emotional harm they cause. The pain left behind is dismissed as collateral damage rather than a consequence. For those on the receiving end, the damage extends beyond the relationship itself. Once trust is violated in this way, future connections feel dangerous. Doubt replaces openness. Self-blame replaces clarity. The individual who exploits trust walks away empowered, while the other is left questioning their judgment, their instincts, and their ability to feel safe with anyone again. Chronic resentment. Chronic resentment is the persistent accumulation of perceived wrongs that are never processed, resolved, or released. In dangerous individuals, this weakness creates an internal ledger where every slight disappointment or unmet expectation is recorded and emotionally preserved. Time does not soften these memories, it sharpens them. The past remains emotionally active, influencing present behavior long after the original event has passed. Emotionally, chronic resentment distorts perception. Neutral actions are interpreted through a lens of hostility. Innocent mistakes feel intentional. Ambiguity is read as disrespect. This internal bitterness keeps the nervous system primed for conflict, making anger feel justified and vigilance feel necessary. The world becomes a place where harm is expected rather than accidental. What makes chronic resentment dangerous is how it fuels justification. Harmful behavior is reframed as deserved retaliation or long overdue correction. Cruelty feels balanced rather than excessive. Because resentment is internal and ongoing, reactions often appear disproportionate to the current situation, leaving others confused about the intensity of the response. This weakness also prevents emotional resolution. Forgiveness feels like weakness. Letting go feels like losing power. Holding onto resentment provides a sense of moral superiority and emotional leverage, even as it corrodes connection. Relationships suffer because conflict is never truly finished. It simply goes dormant. Over time, chronic resentment hardens into identity. The individual becomes defined by grievances rather than growth. Empathy shrinks, patience disappears, and bitterness replaces curiosity. Every interaction becomes filtered through stored anger, ensuring that the past continues to punish the present and that peace remains emotionally inaccessible. Inability to self-reflect. Inability to self-reflect is the psychological failure to examine one's own thoughts, behaviors, and motivations with honesty and curiosity. In dangerous individuals, this weakness locks them into a rigid inner narrative where they are always justified and rarely at fault. Reflection feels threatening because it risks uncovering flaws, contradictions, or responsibility they are unwilling or unable to face. Emotionally, self-reflection requires discomfort. It demands pausing, questioning, and tolerating uncertainty. For someone who lacks this capacity, discomfort triggers defense instead. Rather than looking inward, they project outward. Problems are externalized. Conflicts are reframed as others' failures. The inner world remains untouched, protected by certainty rather than insight. What makes this weakness especially harmful is how it prevents growth. Without reflection, patterns repeat endlessly. The same mistakes are made with different people, in different settings, with the same outcomes. Each repetition strengthens the belief that the problem lies elsewhere. Learning becomes impossible because nothing is ever internalized. This trait also damages communication. Attempts at dialogue feel futile because feedback cannot be processed. Conversations loop, arguments stall, and resolution never arrives. Others eventually stop trying to explain, correct, or clarify, knowing it will lead nowhere. Silence replaces honesty as a form of self-protection. In dangerous individuals, inability to self-reflect fuels entitlement and rigidity. Their perspective hardens into identity. Empathy weakens because understanding others would require questioning themselves. Over time, this creates a person who moves through relationships unchanged by experience, leaving behind confusion and harm while remaining convinced of their own righteousness. Emotional numbness. Emotional numbness is the absence or severe dulling of emotional response, where feelings that normally guide human behavior are muted or inaccessible. In dangerous individuals, this weakness creates a hollow internal landscape where joy, sadness, fear, and empathy barely register. Life is experienced in muted tones, stripped of emotional depth, leaving actions unrestrained by feeling. Emotionally, numbness is often mistaken for calm or strength. The individual appears unbothered, unfazed, and unaffected by situations that would distress others. But this detachment is not stability. It is disconnection. Without emotional feedback, there is no internal signal to stop, reconsider, or care. Pain in others does not resonate. Consequences feel abstract. What makes emotional numbness especially dangerous is the absence of internal resistance. Most people rely on discomfort, guilt, or empathy to regulate behavior. When those sensations are missing, there is nothing to interrupt harmful actions once they begin. Violence, manipulation, or cruelty can occur without the emotional friction that would normally slow or prevent it. Over time, numbness can drive sensation-seeking behavior. When emotions are muted, intensity becomes a substitute. Conflict, dominance, or control may be pursued simply to feel something, anything. This can escalate into increasingly extreme behavior as ordinary experiences fail to register. Emotional numbness also corrodes relationships. Connection requires shared feeling, and without it, intimacy becomes impossible. People sense the absence, even if they cannot name it. Interactions feel empty, unsafe, or one-sided. The individual remains emotionally unreachable, operating without the internal compass that keeps human behavior anchored to care, restraint, and moral awareness. Instrumental view of people. An instrumental view of people is the perception of others primarily as tools, functions, or means to an end, rather than as individuals with inner lives, needs, and boundaries. In dangerous individuals, this weakness reduces human relationships to transactions. People are valued for what they can provide, not for who they are. Once usefulness fades, so does regard. Emotionally, this mindset creates a chilling disconnect. Affection, attention, and interest are extended strategically, not sincerely. Kindness appears when it serves a purpose and disappears when it no longer does. This inconsistency leaves others feeling confused, used, and disposable, sensing that their worth is conditional rather than inherent. What makes this weakness especially dangerous is how it normalizes exploitation. When people are viewed as instruments, harming them feels no different than overusing an object. Emotional damage becomes irrelevant. Boundaries are obstacles. Consent becomes negotiable. The internal question is never, how will this affect them, but what can I gain? This perspective also strips relationships of mutuality. There is no genuine reciprocity, only extraction. Support is offered to create obligation. Listening is used to gather leverage. Even intimacy can become a tactic, designed to secure loyalty, access, or control rather than connection. For those subjected to this mindset, the emotional toll is profound. They may feel unseen even while being engaged, valued only when convenient, and abandoned when depleted. Over time, self-worth erodes as they internalize the message that their primary value lies in utility. An instrumental view of people empties relationships of humanity. It replaces connection with calculation and turns social interaction into a quiet, ongoing act of exploitation. Lack of loyalty. Lack of loyalty is the inability to maintain commitment, allegiance, or emotional faithfulness when circumstances shift or personal benefit is at risk. In dangerous individuals, loyalty is conditional, transactional, and temporary. It exists only as long as it serves their interests. When convenience, advantage, or self-preservation is threatened, attachment dissolves without hesitation. Emotionally, this creates relationships that feel unstable and unsafe. Support is offered confidently but withdrawn abruptly. Promises feel solid until they suddenly mean nothing. People around them sense that connection has an expiration date, even if they cannot articulate why. Trust becomes fragile because consistency is missing at critical moments. What makes lack of loyalty dangerous is how it emerges under pressure. When situations become difficult, risky, or inconvenient, These individuals distance themselves, defect, or betray. Responsibility is avoided, alliances are abandoned, and accountability is displaced onto others. Survival and advantage always outweigh commitment. This weakness also distorts power dynamics. Loyalty may be demanded from others while never reciprocated. The individual expects protection, secrecy, or sacrifice, but feels no obligation to return it. When challenged, they justify betrayal as pragmatism, necessity, or independence, rather than acknowledging the emotional harm caused. Over time, lack of loyalty erodes social bonds. People learn that standing with them carries risk because support will not be mutual when it matters most. This pattern isolates the individual, reinforcing emotional detachment and self-reliance at the cost of trust. Relationships become fragile arrangements rather than durable bonds, collapsing the moment loyalty requires personal cost. Pleasure in control. Pleasure in control is the emotional gratification derived from directing, restricting, or overpowering others. In dangerous individuals, control is not merely a means to an end, it is the reward itself. The act of influencing another person's choices, emotions, or behavior produces a sense of satisfaction that replaces empathy, connection, or mutual respect. Emotionally, this pleasure fills an internal void. Control creates a surge of relief, certainty, and superiority that temporarily quiets insecurity or inner chaos. Watching others comply, hesitate, or submit reinforces the belief that they are powerful and untouchable. The emotional payoff becomes addictive, encouraging repeated attempts to dominate situations even when control is unnecessary. What makes this weakness especially disturbing is how it reframes harm as enjoyment. Discomfort in others becomes validating. Resistance becomes a challenge. Boundaries become invitations to push harder. The emotional response is not guilt or concern, but excitement or calm satisfaction when control is reasserted. This pleasure often manifests subtly at first. Decisions are overridden for their own good. Emotions are steered through pressure or withdrawal. Over time, control escalates as the individual seeks stronger emotional reactions to achieve the same sense of satisfaction. What once required suggestion now requires coercion. In relationships, pleasure in control erodes autonomy. Others begin to feel managed rather than known. Choices feel unsafe. Independence feels punished. The controlled individual may sense that their discomfort fuels the dynamic, deepening confusion and helplessness. Because control feels good, there is little motivation to stop. The emotional reward outweighs concern for consequences. Over time, dominance becomes a source of pleasure rather than a behavior, making empathy irrelevant and transforming relationships into arenas where power is pursued for emotional gratification alone. Aggressive defensiveness. Aggressive defensiveness is the reflexive, hostile response to perceived criticism, threat, or challenge, even when none was intended. In dangerous individuals, defensiveness does not serve protection, it serves domination. Any question, feedback, or disagreement is interpreted as an attack on their identity, authority, or self-worth, triggering immediate counter-aggression. Emotionally, this weakness is rooted in deep insecurity paired with fragile self-image. The individual cannot tolerate vulnerability or uncertainty, so they respond with force. Raised voices, accusations, sarcasm, or intimidation appear instantly, shutting down dialogue before it can expose weakness. The goal is not to be understood, but to regain control of the emotional space. What makes aggressive defensiveness especially destabilizing is how it trains others into silence. People learn that honesty leads to conflict and curiosity leads to punishment. Over time, they self-censor, suppress concerns, and abandon attempts at resolution just to preserve peace. The relationship becomes emotionally unsafe, ruled by fear of reaction rather than mutual respect. This defensiveness also distorts reality. Accountability is reframed as persecution. Feedback becomes disrespect. Boundaries are treated as hostility. The individual remains locked in a permanent state of readiness to fight, unable to distinguish between actual threat and emotional discomfort. Aggressive defensiveness prevents growth because growth requires reflection, and reflection requires tolerance for discomfort. Instead, the individual externalizes blame and escalates conflict, reinforcing their belief that the world is hostile. This weakness creates an emotional minefield where truth is dangerous, connection is fragile, and power is maintained through intimidation rather than trust. Self-Justification of Harm. Self-justification of harm is the psychological process of rationalizing harmful actions so they feel acceptable, necessary, or even righteous. In dangerous individuals, this weakness acts as an internal permission slip. Instead of experiencing guilt or hesitation, they rewrite the story so that harm feels deserved, unavoidable, or provoked. The focus shifts away from the damage caused and toward protecting their self-image. Emotionally, this mechanism shields the individual from discomfort. Accepting that one has caused harm would require empathy, accountability, and change. Self-justification removes that burden. By reframing themselves as misunderstood, pushed too far, or morally superior, they preserve a sense of innocence while continuing destructive behavior. What makes this weakness especially dangerous is its adaptability. Almost any action can be justified with the right narrative. Cruelty becomes discipline, manipulation becomes necessity, aggression becomes self-defense. The more often harm is justified, the easier it becomes, creating a cycle where behavior escalates while conscience stays silent. This mindset also distorts memory and perception. Events are selectively recalled to support the justification, while contradictory details are ignored or dismissed. Over time, the individual genuinely believes their own narrative, making intervention or confrontation nearly impossible. Any challenge to their version of events is treated as hostility or ignorance. For those affected, self-justified harm is deeply destabilizing. Pain is denied, minimized, or blamed on the victim, leaving no space for repair or validation. In this environment, suffering is not acknowledged as real. It is reframed as deserved. Harm continues not because it feels wrong, but because it has been successfully transformed into something that feels right. Contempt for weakness. Contempt for weakness is the deep disdain for vulnerability, emotional expression, or perceived fragility in others. In dangerous individuals, this weakness reflects an internal rejection of their own vulnerability, which is projected outward as judgment and hostility. Anything that resembles need, fear, or dependence triggers discomfort, which is then converted into superiority or cruelty. Emotionally, this contempt creates a cold and punishing environment. Struggle is mocked rather than supported. Pain is minimized rather than acknowledged. Those who show vulnerability are treated as inferior, burdensome, or deserving of mistreatment. This response teaches others to hide their emotions, suppress their needs, and endure suffering silently. What makes contempt for weakness dangerous is how it justifies harm. When vulnerability is seen as pathetic or unacceptable, compassion disappears. Exploitation feels reasonable. Aggression feels corrective. The individual frames cruelty as strength, believing that harshness builds resilience rather than trauma. This mindset also reinforces dominance. By positioning themselves as strong and others as weak, they establish hierarchy and control. Equality feels threatening because it would require recognizing shared human limits. Instead, power is maintained through emotional invalidation and intimidation. Over time, contempt for weakness isolates the individual emotionally. Genuine intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is precisely what they reject. Relationships become rigid and fear-based, built on performance rather than authenticity. The cost is high, connection erodes, empathy withers, and strength becomes an armor that protects nothing but insecurity while inflicting lasting emotional harm on those deemed too human to deserve care. Rejection of accountability. Rejection of accountability is the active refusal to accept responsibility, even when evidence, consequences, and impact are undeniable. In dangerous individuals, this is not passive avoidance, but deliberate resistance. Accountability feels like a threat to identity, power, and control. Accepting responsibility would mean admitting limitation, fault, or vulnerability, and that feels intolerable. Emotionally, this rejection is driven by fear and entitlement. Fear of shame, fear of exposure, fear of losing dominance. Rather than process these emotions, the individual redirects them outward. Blame is reassigned. Context is twisted. Intent is weaponized to erase impact. The emotional goal is not truth, but self-protection at any cost. What makes this weakness especially destructive is how aggressively it distorts reality. Events are rewritten. Facts are minimized. Others' experiences are questioned or invalidated. Over time, the individual constructs an internal narrative where they are perpetually wronged, misunderstood, or provoked. This narrative allows them to act harmfully while maintaining a sense of moral innocence. Rejection of accountability also trains others to carry the burden. Victims are pressured to explain, justify, or forgive without acknowledgement. Conversations become circular, draining energy without resolution. Eventually, people stop seeking fairness and focus on survival, knowing responsibility will never be shared. In dangerous individuals, this rejection escalates conflict rather than resolving it. Apologies are performative or absent. Change is promised, but never anchored to ownership. Without accountability, harm has no endpoint. The individual moves forward untouched, while others absorb the emotional cost, trapped in a dynamic where truth is negotiable and responsibility is permanently displaced.